My name is Chloe. I am 31 years old, and I used to be a regional supply chain manager before I traded boardrooms for hospice care. I want you to picture the Cook County Probate Court. It is a room designed to make you feel small with its heavy oak paneling and ceilings so high they swallow your voice. I am sitting at the plaintiff table. My hands are folded tightly in my lap to stop them from shaking. Directly across the aisle sits my mother, Cynthia. She leans across the polished mahogany of her table. I can hear the heavy click of her designer pearls against the wood. Her lips are painted a flawless crimson, and they curve into a vicious sneer as she hisses at me. That 13 million belongs to us. You are just the hired help. She smiles when she says it. She truly believes she has won. She looks at me the same way she looks at the valet who parks her car or the server who brings her overpriced salad. But she has absolutely no idea that the judge sitting high above us is holding a document that is about to legally ruin her perfect insulated life. To understand how we ended up in this courtroom with millions of dollars and my entire future on the line, I have to take you back to exactly 72 hours earlier. The air in Grandpa Thomas' house smelled like rubbing alcohol and impending grief. It was a modest suburban Chicago home, the kind with a squeaky front porch step and faded floral wallpaper that he refused to change because my grandmother had picked it out 40 years ago. For the last 6 years, this house had been my entire world. I had packed up my apartment, walked away from an $85,000 a year career, and moved into his spare bedroom when the Parkinson disease began stealing his independence. I am holding his hand. His skin is thin as parchment, cool to the touch, and bruised purple from a relentless parade of intravenous lines. The hospice nurse had left an hour ago, after adjusting his morphine drip, giving me that sympathetic, tight-lipped nod that meant the end was no longer a distant threat. It was here in the room with us. His breathing has changed. It is no longer the steady rhythm I have monitored through countless sleepless nights. It is shallow-labored and punctuated by long, terrifying pauses. The death rattle. That is what the pamphlets call it, but no piece of paper can prepare you for the sound of the only person who truly loves you fighting for one more lungful of air. Panic rises in my throat, thick and suffocating. I reach for my phone with my free hand, my fingers slipping against the glass screen. I dial my parents' number. It rings. Once, twice, 3 times. With every ring, I look at Grandpa Thomas, chest watching it rise with a shudder and fall with a weak sigh. Finally, the line connects. Hello. My dad Robert answers. His voice is loud, competing with the unmistakable clinking of crystal wine glasses and the low, wealthy murmur of a country club dining room. Dad? I choke out the word tears, finally spilling hot down my cheeks. Dad, it is Grandpa. The nurse said his organs are shutting down. He is actively dying. You and Mom need to get here right now. I expect a gasp. I expect the sound of a chair scraping backward as my father rushes to his feet. I expect him to tell me he's on his way, that he's coming to say goodbye to the man who raised him. Instead, my father lets out a long, irritated sigh. The kind of sigh a person makes when they are stuck behind a slow driver in traffic. Chloe, he says, and I can hear the distinct annoyance clipping his syllables. Your brother Brandon is pitching his new app to investors tonight. We are at a dinner with the venture capital people. We cannot just leave. The words hit me so hard I physically flinch. I look down at Grandpa Thomas. His eyes are closed, but his brow is furrowed in pain. He is dying, I say again, my voice dropping to a desperate, ragged whisper. Dad, he has minutes left, maybe an hour if he fights. You have to come. Look, my father says, his tone shifting from annoyed to patronizing. This is a crucial night for Brandon. Sacrifice is what family does, Chloe. Brandon has a future to build. We are locking in seed funding. Just have the nurses handle it. Call me when it is over. Before I can scream, before I can beg, the line goes dead. I pull the phone away from my ear and stare at the darkened screen. Just have the nurses handle it. As if my grandfather, his own father, is a broken appliance that needs hauling away. As if the last 6 years of my life, the years I spent bathing him, blending his meals, lifting him in and out of his wheelchair, while my spine screamed in agony, were just a service I provided, so they did not have to be bothered. A sharp, gasping sound pulls me back. Grandpa Thomas' chest arches upward. His eyes flutter open, sightless and unfocused. I drop the phone and grip his hand with both of mine, leaning over the bed so my face is inches from his. I am here, Grandpa. I sob, pressing my forehead against his knuckles. I am right here. You are not alone. I love you so much. It is okay to go. I am here. He lets out one long, trembling exhale. The tension leaves his face, replacing the lines of pain with a sudden, profound stillness. The machinery in the room continues its gentle hum, but the breathing has stopped. The silence that follows is the heaviest thing I have ever felt. He is gone. The only man who ever looked at me and saw something valuable. The man who stepped in to raise me when my parents were too busy fawning over my brother is gone. I do not know how long I sit there. Time loses its meaning. I wash his face with a warm washcloth. I comb his sparse silver hair. I hold his cold hand and I cry until my chest aches and my vision blurs. I perform the final quiet acts of caregiving with a mechanical devotion, honoring the vessel that held the best man I ever knew. Eventually, I pick up my phone and call the hospice doctor to declare the time of death. Then I call the funeral home. They tell me they will send a transport vehicle within 2 hours. I sit in the armchair in the corner of his room, pulling my knees to my chest wrapped in his old wool sweater. The house is completely silent. I am 31 years old, unmarried, unemployed with no savings left, and the only person who cared if I existed is lying lifeless in a hospital bed a few feet away. I am utterly alone. An hour and 45 minutes pass. I am staring blankly at the wall, listening for the sound of the funeral director's hearse pulling into the driveway. Instead, I hear the heavy crunch of tires on gravel, multiple car doors slamming shut, heavy footsteps marching up the wooden steps of the front porch. Before I can stand up, the front door bursts open. It does not creak open hesitantly, like a family arriving to mourn. It is thrown open with force, hitting the entryway wall with a loud bang. Loud voices echo down the hallway. I step out of Grandpa Thomas' room, my eyes swollen, my body trembling from exhaustion and grief. It is not the funeral director. It is my father Robert, my mother Cynthia, and my golden child brother Brandon. They are not wearing the somber clothes of a grieving family. Brandon is wearing a tailored Italian suit, his hair slicked back, looking every inch the arrogant startup founder. My mother is draped in her cashmere wrap, holding a steaming cup of expensive coffee. But it is what they are carrying that makes the blood freeze in my veins. My father has a thick leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Brandon is carrying a stack of flattened cardboard moving boxes and a roll of heavy-duty packing tape. My mother has a silver clipboard pressed against her chest, a pen poised in her manicured hand. They are less than 2 hours late to his death, but they are right on time to pick apart his life. "Chloe," my mother says briskly as she spots me in the hallway. She does not offer a hug. She does not ask how he passed. She looks past me, her eyes scanning the antique grandfather clock in the living room. "Good, you are awake. We need to get moving. The estate appraisers are coming on Monday, but we are taking the valuables to our house tonight for safekeeping." I stand there, blocking the hallway, unable to process the sheer audacity of what I am witnessing. "He is still in there," I whisper, my voice cracking. "The transport team has not even arrived yet. His body is still warm." My father sighs, stepping forward and checking his gold wristwatch. "Let us not be melodramatic, Chloe. He has passed. Lingering over the body does not do anyone any good. Brandon, go check the study. Make sure you get the silver coin collection from the desk drawer. I will head up to the master bedroom." Brandon drops the moving boxes on the hardwood floor with a loud, disrespectful thud. He smirks at me, adjusting his expensive cuffs. "Move out of the way, sis. We have a lot of inventory to log, and I have an investor celebration party to get back to by midnight." My vision goes white at the edges. A protective primal rage flares up inside my chest, burning away the thick fog of my grief. For 6 years, I have shrunk myself. For 6 years, I have played the obedient, invisible caregiver, asking for nothing, taking no salary, draining my own meager savings to buy his favorite brand of pudding or the extra soft blankets the insurance refused to cover. I gave up my 20s. I gave up my career. I gave up my life. And they could not even be bothered to pause their country club dinner to hold his hand as he died. Brandon takes a step forward, reaching toward the door handle of Grandpa Thomas' room. He's going for the vintage Rolex he knows Grandpa kept on the bedside table. "Do not touch that door," I snap. My voice is not a whisper anymore. It rings out sharp and hard, echoing in the narrow hallway. It is a voice I have not used in 6 years. A voice that used to command logistics meetings and negotiate supply contracts. Brandon pauses, his hand hovering in the air. He looks at me like a dog that has just spoken English. Excuse me. I step directly into his path, squaring my shoulders, forcing him to look me in the eye. I said, "Do not touch that door. You do not get to walk in there and strip him for parts like a stolen car. You did not visit him once in the last 3 years. You did not change his sheets when he lost control of his bladder. You did not hold a cup of water to his lips when he was too weak to lift his own head." "Chloe, that is quite enough," my mother snaps, stepping forward and brandishing her clipboard like a weapon. "We are his legal family. We have every right to secure his assets. You are being hysterical." Hysterical. I let out a harsh, broken laugh. I am the only one who acted like family. I gave up my $85,000 a year career to keep him out of a state-run nursing home because Dad refused to pay for private care. I gave up my apartment. I gave up everything. And you, I point a shaking finger at Brandon. You dropped out of 3 different colleges, blew through hundreds of thousands of Dad's money on failed businesses, and you could not even spare 10 minutes to say goodbye. "Sacrifice is what family does, Chloe," my mother says, her voice dripping with cold condescension. She adjusts her cashmere wrap, looking at me with pure disdain. "Brandon has a future to build. You do not. You are doing what you were meant to do. Helping out. Helping out." The words feel like a physical blow. They do not see my sacrifice as love. They see it as my proper place at the bottom of their hierarchy. My father steps between me and Brandon, his face flushed with anger. He sets his leather portfolio on the hallway console table and unzips it with a sharp, aggressive motion. "I am not going to stand here and argue with you in my own father's house," he growls. "You want to talk about what is fair? Fine, let us talk about the law." He pulls out a thick legal document bound in a blue cover and shoves it into my chest. I stumble back slightly, instinctively clutching the heavy stack of paper. "That is a certified copy of his will," my father says, a triumphant, cruel smile twisting his face. "Dated 2015. I am the sole executor and the sole beneficiary. Everything, the house, the stock portfolio, the antiques, the bank accounts, it all belongs to me." I stare down at the document. The letters blur together. 2015. That was right before Grandpa got sick. Right before they convinced me to move in and take care of him. My father reaches into his pocket and pulls out a single sheet of paper, pre-folded, and drops it on the floor at my feet. And that, he says coldly, is a formal 30-day eviction notice. "You have lived here rent-free for 6 years, Chloe. The free ride is over. Pack your things. Brandon and his wife are moving into this house next month." The front door remains open behind them. The cold night wind blows into the hallway, chilling the sweat on my neck. They stand there, a united front of greed and entitlement, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to cry and beg and accept my place as the discarded hired help. I slowly bend down and pick up the piece of paper from the hardwood floor. The eviction notice is printed on official law firm stationery. They did not just decide this tonight. They have had this prepared for weeks, maybe months. They have been waiting for his heart to stop beating so they could spring this trap. "You planned this," I whisper, my voice raw. As I look up at my father, the man who used to teach me how to ride a bike, I see nothing but a hollow shell of a human being. "You sat around planning how to throw me out on the street while I was spoon-feeding your father his meals. Do not play the victim, Chloe," my father replies, his tone bored. "It is unbecoming. You had free room and board for 6 years. Most people would be grateful. Now, if you will excuse us, we have work to do." He moves to step around me, but I do not budge. I plant my feet firmly on the faded runner rug, spreading my arms across the width of the hallway. "You are not going in there until the transport team arrives," I say, my voice steadying, finding a rhythm of absolute defiance. "You will not disrespect him while his body is still in this house. You will have to physically move me." For a second, I see a flash of genuine rage in my father's eyes. He steps forward, his chest almost touching mine, trying to use his height to intimidate me. But I do not shrink. I look up at him, my chin raised. I am not the quiet, compliant daughter anymore. The worst thing that could happen to me today has already happened. I have nothing left to lose, and that makes me dangerous. "Fine," my father spits. Stepping back and straightening his tie. "We will start with the dining room." Brandon grabbed a crystal. Cynthia started logging the artwork. They turn away from me, moving like a swarm of locusts into the living areas of the house. I hear the tearing of packing tape, the clinking of expensive glassware being hastily shoved into boxes, the harsh calculating murmurs of my mother assigning dollar values to family heirlooms. I lean back against the closed door of Grandpa Thomas' room, sliding down the wood until I'm sitting on the floor. I press my hands over my ears to block out the sounds of their pillaging. I am penniless. I have no job to return to. I have no home after 30 days. I look at the legal document resting in my lap, the 2015 will that gives them everything and leaves me with absolutely nothing. According to the law, they hold all the power. They have the money, the lawyers, and the absolute lack of morality required to crush me. But as I sit there in the cold hallway listening to my golden child brother, laughing about how much he's going to get for Grandpa's vintage Mustang, I make a silent promise to the man resting behind the door. I promise I will not let them win. I promise I will fight them with every ounce of strength I have left. I just have to find a way to survive the next 30 days. I step directly into Brandon's path, just as his manicured fingers graze the heavy gold band of Grandpa Thomas's vintage Rolex. That watch had sat on the mahogany nightstand for 6 years. Grandpa bought it in 1978 after his first big patent sale. He used to let me press my ear to the glass and listen to the sweeping second hand when I was a little girl. Now, less than 2 hours after his heart stopped beating, my brother is trying to pocket it like a cheap souvenir found at a yard sale. I slam my hand down on the nightstand, physically blocking the watch. My palm hits the polished wood with a loud smack that echoes sharply in the quiet, sterile room. Do not touch that, I say. My voice is shaking, but it is not from the crushing weight of grief anymore. It is from a pure, blinding rage that is bubbling up from the very bottom of my stomach, burning through my exhaustion. Brandon pulls his hand back as if the metal had burned him. He looks at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer unfiltered entitlement. He adjusts the cuffs of his custom-tailored Italian suit, a suit paid for by my father's credit card, and lets out a short, arrogant laugh. "Relax, Chloe," he says, rolling his eyes and shifting his weight. "I am just keeping it safe. You know the estate appraisers are going to catalog everything anyway. I am doing us a favor by securing the valuables before strangers come into the house." Doing us a favor. The words hang in the stagnant air, toxic and deeply absurd. I look at my brother. He is 33 years old. He has never held a real job for more than 6 consecutive months. His skin is perfectly tanned from a recent trip to Cabo that my parents funded, and he smells like expensive cologne and top-shelf liquor. Then I look down at my own hands. My knuckles are raw, cracked, and bleeding from washing hospice bedsheets with harsh bleach. My fingernails are clipped painfully short because long nails make it too difficult to change a feeding tube without pinching the skin. I am wearing a faded college sweatshirt that I have not washed in 3 days because I have not slept in 3 days. "You do not get to do anyone a favor in this house," I tell him, my voice rising, vibrating with years of suppressed anger. "You do not get to walk in here wearing a designer suit and claim his things. You have not stepped foot in this room in over a year. You did not even call on his birthday." Brandon scoffs and takes a step closer, trying to use his height and broad shoulders to intimidate me. "I am building a startup, Chloe. I have investors to manage. I have meetings with venture capitalists. I cannot just put my entire life on hold to sit around in a sick room watching someone waste away. Some of us actually have futures to worry about. Some of us are building wealth." That is when the fragile dam inside me finally breaks completely. 6 years of silence. 6 years of biting my tongue until it bled to keep the peace. 6 years of swallowing my own pride and needs so my family would not fracture. It all shatters in an instant, leaving nothing but sharp, dangerous edges. Building a startup, I screamed the words, stepping forward and forcing him to retreat a step. "You are playing businessman with Dad's money. Do not you dare talk to me about putting your life on hold." I was making $85,000 a year as a regional supply chain manager. I had a corner apartment downtown with a view of the river. I had a career trajectory. I had a life. I gave up all of it. I gave up my late 20s. I gave up my friends. I gave up my independence to move into this tiny spare bedroom because you and Dad refused to step up. I point a shaking finger at the hospital bed where Grandpa Thomas is still lying, his face pale and peaceful under the dim overhead light, the machinery beside him finally silent. I spent the last 6 years bathing him, Brandon. I pureed his food when his throat muscles failed and he could no longer swallow solids. I lifted him in and out of his wheelchair while my own spine screamed in absolute agony. I sat up with him at 2 in the morning when the Parkinson's tremors were so violent he was terrified to close his eyes. I held his hand while he cried in pain. I did the grueling, backbreaking, invisible, humiliating work of keeping this proud man out of a sterile state-run nursing home because our father refused to pay for private in-home care. My chest is heaving. Tears of absolute, unadulterated fury are streaming down my face hot and fast, but I do not wipe them away. I want them to see my anger. I want them to feel the weight of it. And what exactly were you doing while I was keeping him alive? I demand, stepping closer to Brandon until he is backed awkwardly against the heavy wooden bedroom door. Shall we review your very important schedule? You dropped out of Penn State because the business program required too much math. Then Dad paid your way into NYU, where you lasted exactly 2 semesters before you decided you wanted to be a music producer. Then it was a private liberal arts college in Colorado that you quit to start a failed cryptocurrency company. You blew through hundreds of thousands of dollars of Dad's money. You have never finished a single thing you started in your entire life. You are a parasite playing dress-up. Brandon's face flushes a deep, ugly red. His jaw clenches and he opens his mouth to yell back. But before he can launch a defense, a cold, measured voice cuts through the charged air of the room. That is quite enough, Chloe. My mother, Cynthia, steps into the bedroom. She does not look at the hospital bed. She does not look at the man who was her father-in-law for 40 years, the man who helped pay for her wedding. She looks only at me, and her expression is one of utter, chilling disdain. She reaches up with a manicured hand and casually adjusts her expensive gray cashmere wrap, smoothing the soft fabric over her shoulder as if dealing with my grief is simply a minor, tasteless nuisance. You are being hysterical, she says, her tone dripping with cold condescension. Lower your voice immediately. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are disrespecting this household. I turn to face her, my breath catching painfully in my throat. I am embarrassing myself. Mom? Brandon is trying to steal Grandpa's watch before the funeral home even gets here to transport his body. They did not even come to say goodbye to him when he was begging for you. My mother sighs. It is a long, heavy, theatrical sigh designed to make me feel like a petulant, irrational child. She walks over to Brandon, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor, and places a protective maternal hand on his arm, standing shoulder to shoulder with her golden child. Brandon is simply securing valuable family assets before strangers enter the home, she says smoothly, without an ounce of shame. And as for your little outburst about your career, let us be honest with ourselves, Chloe. You were a mid-level manager at a shipping logistics company. It is not exactly like you walked away from being a cardiothoracic surgeon. You were moving boxes on a spreadsheet. The sheer cruelty of her words feels like a physical punch to my ribs. I stare at her, completely unable to comprehend how a mother could speak to her own daughter this way, how she could so easily diminish a half-decade of grueling sacrifice. I gave up my life. I whisper, my voice raw, hoarse, and broken. I did the work none of you wanted to do. I saved this family hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical care. I gave him dignity. Sacrifice is what family does, Chloe. My mother says, her voice chillingly calm, completely devoid of empathy. She looks at me with eyes that hold absolutely no warmth, no gratitude, no maternal affection whatsoever. We all play our parts in this family. Brandon has a future to build. He is an entrepreneur. He needs freedom, flexibility, and capital to establish his legacy in the tech world. You have always been more suited to the background. You are organized, you are quiet, you are dutiful. You are doing what you were meant to do. You are helping out. Helping out! The phrase echoes in my mind, ringing with a sickening crystal clarity. She does not see the last 6 years as an act of profound selfless love. She does not see my physical exhaustion, my isolation, or my total financial ruin. She sees my sacrifice as my proper place in their natural order of things. Brandon is the brilliant star who deserves the world handed to him on a silver platter, and I am the hired help expected to work for free, expected to be grateful for the opportunity to serve them. Before I can respond to this devastating, reality-altering realization, my father enters the room. Robert is a man who moves through life expecting the seas to part for him. He walks past me without a glance, ignoring his dead father entirely. He sets his heavy leather briefcase down on the wooden dresser, right next to a tray of medical supplies, and snaps the brass locks open. The sharp metallic click is loud in the tense silence of the room. "I am not going to listen to you children bicker over watches and hurt feelings," my father says. His voice is deep, authoritative, and completely empty of grief. "We have major financial matters to secure and a very tight legal window to do it in. Chloe, stop your crying and pay attention. You wanted to talk about who deserves what in this house. Let us look at the facts." He reaches into the dark interior of the briefcase and pulls out a thick legal document bound in a heavy blue cover. It looks pristine, official, and terrifying. He holds it up, tapping the thick stack of paper with his index finger. "This," my father announces, his voice echoing slightly, "is your grandfather's last will and testament. It was drafted by my attorneys and notarized in 2015. My mind races frantically. 2015. That was right before Grandpa Thomas was officially diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. That was the exact same time my parents sat me down in their sprawling living room, bought me dinner, and begged me to move in with him. They had told me it would only be for a few months until they could arrange proper care facilities. They told me they would help me out financially every step of the way. They lied about all of it to trap me here. And according to this document, my father continues opening the pages and reading from the dense legal text without a shred of emotion. "I am the sole executor of the estate. More importantly, I am the sole beneficiary." The words drop into the room like heavy, suffocating stones. I stare at the blue folder, my exhausted mind struggling to process the absolute magnitude of what he is saying. "Everything," I ask, my voice barely a squeak, completely stripped of its previous anger. "Everything," my father confirms, snapping the heavy document shut. "The stock portfolio, which currently sits at roughly $13 million. The liquid bank accounts. The vintage cars in the garage. And this house. It all transfers directly to me. Your grandfather recognized that I am the only one in this family with the financial acumen to manage and protect this level of wealth." I look from my father to my mother to my brother. They are standing together, a united, impenetrable front of greed. They are looking at me not as a grieving granddaughter, not as a family member who just lost the person she loved most, but as a minor nuisance they finally have the absolute legal authority to dispose of. "But I took care of him," I say, the desperation creeping into my tone, despite my best efforts to stay strong. "I drained my own savings to buy his medications when the Medicare coverage maxed out. I paid the property taxes on this house last year with my last $10,000 because you said your funds were tied up in investments. You looked me in the eye and promised me I would be compensated when the estate was settled." My father lets out a dry, harsh, humorless chuckle. "Please, Chloe, do not be naive. Verbal agreements are not legally binding in the state of Illinois. You lived here, rent-free for 6 solid years. I consider that more than fair compensation for your basic caregiving services. I am no longer a daughter. I am an unpaid, discarded contractor whose contract has just been aggressively terminated." My father reaches back into his briefcase. He does not pull out a checkbook to reimburse me for the property taxes. He does not pull out a token of appreciation for keeping his father alive. He pulls out a single sheet of paper, pre-folded into neat thirds, and holds it out toward me. I do not take it. I just stare at his outstretched hand, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. "Take it, Chloe," he orders coldly, his tone leaving no room for argument. I slowly reach out and take the paper. My hands are shaking so violently that the thick paper rattles audibly. I unfold it. It is printed on the expensive embossed official stationery of his corporate law firm. The bold black letters at the top of the page blur and swim in my vision, but I force my eyes to focus on the text. It is a formal, legally binding court-stamped 30-day notice of eviction. I look up at him, the man who used to read me bedtime stories, the man who carried me on his shoulders at the state fair. I look deep into his eyes, and I see absolutely nothing. "You are evicting me," I ask, the sheer terrifying reality of my situation crashing down on me like a collapsing concrete building. I have $0 in my bank account. I have no job to return to. I have nowhere to go. You are throwing me out on the street. My father straightens his silk tie, completely unmoved by the raw panic in my voice. "I am giving you a full 30 days to vacate the premises. That is more than generous under the law. You are a smart, capable girl. You will figure it out. Get a job at a temp agency. Rent a cheap studio apartment. It is time for you to face the real world. My mother steps forward, a cruel, triumphant smile playing at the corners of her perfectly painted lips. It is time for you to finally stand on your own 2 feet, Chloe. We have plans for this property, and we need it empty. Plans. I echo, feeling dizzy, the room beginning to tilt. Brandon steps out from behind our mother, his chest puffed out with unearned victory. He looks around the room, eyeing the antique mahogany furniture, the large bay windows, the expensive hardwood floors beneath his Italian leather shoes. Yes, sis, Brandon says, flashing a brilliant, expensive mocking smile. Pack your things. Jessica and I are moving in next month. We need a bigger place to entertain clients for the startup, and Dad is letting us have the house. We are going to completely gut this depressing room and turn it into a home gym. The room spins. The sheer audacity, the cold, calculated cruelty of it all is entirely suffocating. They waited for him to take his final breath, and before his body is even cold, before the hearse has even arrived, they are handing me an eviction notice so the golden child can have a free $13 million mansion to play in. They have systematically stripped me of my career, my youth, my savings, and now they are stripping me of my home. I stand there, in the center of the room, clutching the eviction notice in my raw, tired hands, surrounded by the people who share my blood, but possess absolutely none of my heart. I am completely and utterly ruined. But as I look at their smug, victorious faces, the panic inside me slowly hardens into something else. Something icy. Something sharp. They think they have won. They think I am too broken, too exhausted, and too poor to fight back. They have no idea what I am about to do. The morning after a death does not feel like a new day. It feels like a continuation of a terrible nightmare that you are simply not allowed to wake up from. I had not slept a single minute. I sat in the worn armchair in the corner of my bedroom until the winter sun finally crawled over the horizon, staring blankly at the wall, listening to the suffocating silence of a house that no longer had my grandfather breathing inside it. At 8 in the morning, I forced myself to stand up. My joints ached with the deep settling exhaustion of someone who has spent 6 years sleeping with one ear, listening for a medical monitor. I took a brief scalding shower, hoping the hot water would thaw the block of ice sitting heavily in my chest, but it did nothing. I put on a pair of dark jeans and a plain gray sweater. I had responsibilities. Grandpa Thomas had outstanding hospice bills for his compounded pain medications and the specialized oxygen equipment that had kept him comfortable during his final week. I was the one who managed his accounts. I was the one who made sure his final days were not interrupted by collection calls or financial stress. I drove my 10-year-old car to the local pharmacy. The sky over our wealthy suburb was a bruised, angry, purple, threatening, freezing rain. The pharmacy was brightly lit and smelled aggressively of artificial pine cleaner and rubbing alcohol. I stood in line behind a mother buying cough syrup for her toddler and an elderly man arguing about his insurance copay. I felt completely detached from the world around them. I was a ghost, haunting the aisles of a mundane drugstore. When it was my turn, I approached the counter and gave the pharmacist the name. She was a kind woman named Brenda who knew us well. Her face immediately fell into a mask of professional, practiced sympathy. She handed me a printed invoice for $480. I pulled out my debit card. It was a blue bank card linked to the joint account Grandpa and I had shared for 5 years. He had set it up specifically so I could manage the household expenses, buy his groceries, and pay his medical copays without ever having to ask my father for permission. I swiped the card through the machine. The digital screen displayed the word processing for 3 agonizing seconds before flashing a harsh red message. Declined. I frowned, my exhausted brain struggling to make sense of the word. I tried it again. I wiped the magnetic strip on the edge of my sweater and inserted the chip. Declined. Please contact your financial institution. Brenda looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and deep awkwardness. Is there another card you would like to use, Chloe? I do not have another card, I whispered. The line of customers behind me shifted impatiently, shoes shuffling on the linoleum floor. I felt a hot, prickling flush of humiliation crawl up my neck and spread across my cheeks. I mumbled an incoherent apology, grabbed my purse, and practically ran out into the freezing parking lot. I climbed into the driver's seat of my car and locked the doors, my breath pluming in the cold air. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely unlock my phone screen. I opened the banking application. I typed in my password. The loading circle spun for what felt like an absolute eternity. When the dashboard finally appeared, my stomach dropped completely out of my body. The joint account, the one that held nearly $14,000 just yesterday to cover the upcoming property taxes and end-of-life medical bills, was completely gone. It did not show a zero balance. It was entirely erased from my dashboard, as if it had never existed in the first place. The only account visible on the screen was my personal checking account. I stared at the balance. $42.18. That was it. That was the sum total of my financial existence after giving up my late 20s and early 30s to provide round-the-clock care. I refreshed the application. I closed it and opened it again, praying it was a network glitch. The numbers did not change. $42. I had less than half a tank of gas. I had absolutely no groceries in my personal mini fridge back at the house. I had no savings. I had no safety net whatsoever. The money was simply gone. I threw the car into reverse tires, spinning slightly on the icy asphalt, and drove directly to the bank branch in the center of town. I did not care that I looked like a wreck. I did not care that my eyes were bloodshot and my hair was damp. I parked illegally in a loading zone and stormed through the heavy glass doors of the bank. The branch manager was a man named Richard Davis. I knew him very well. He was a member of the same exclusive country club as my father. They played golf together every other Sunday and drank expensive scotch in the clubhouse. He had attended my high school graduation party over a decade ago and eaten our catered food. I walked straight past the winding line of customers and the teller counter, heading directly for his glass-walled office in the back of the building. Richard looked up from his computer monitor as I pushed his door open without knocking. His professional, welcoming smile froze instantly and then slowly melted into an expression of deep, agonizing discomfort. "Chloe," he said, standing up quickly and adjusting his expensive silk tie. "I heard the tragic news about Thomas. I am so deeply sorry for your loss. He was a truly great man." "Where is the money, Richard?" I asked. I did not have the energy for pleasantries. I did not have the capacity for polite small talk. I dropped my useless plastic debit card onto his polished mahogany desk. "The joint account is gone. I need to pay his hospice bills right now, and my card is declining." "Where did the funds go?" Richard sighed. It was a heavy, calculated sigh designed to project empathy while maintaining authority. He gestured to the leather guest chair across from his desk, but I refused to sit down. I stood there, crossing my arms over my chest, demanding an answer. "I am afraid I cannot help you with that specific account anymore." "Chloe," he said softly, leaning his knuckles on the desk surface. "You know I cannot discuss the details of a client account without proper current authorization." "It is my account," I shot back, my voice rising slightly, echoing off the glass walls. "My name is on it. I have been signing the checks for 5 years. You know this. I come in here every single month to make deposits and process his medical payments." "You are a secondary signer." He corrected his tone, shifting into something much more clinical, much more defensive. "Thomas was the primary account holder. As of 9 o'clock this morning, the account was frozen and the funds were legally transferred into an estate holding account. Transferred by who, I demanded, though the cold, heavy dread in my stomach already knew the terrible answer. Richard looked away, unable to meet my eye. He focused entirely on a silver fountain pen sitting on his leather blotter. "By the legal executor of the estate. Your father came in right when we opened our doors this morning. He presented a certified copy of the death certificate and a fully executed power of attorney dated from 2015. He also provided the last will and testament naming him as the sole beneficiary and executor. Under state banking regulations, I had absolutely no choice but to comply with his legal directives. I froze all auxiliary access immediately. My father was sitting at a country club dinner when Grandpa died," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "He arrived at the house with moving boxes less than 2 hours later, and he was waiting outside this bank before the doors even opened to strip me of the only money I had access to." Richard spread his hands in a gesture of helpless corporate compliance. "Chloe, you have to understand my difficult position here. Robert is the legal executor. He has total financial control over the estate assets until the probate process is concluded by a judge. He specifically instructed me to revoke your access to prevent any unauthorized withdrawals during the transition period. Unauthorized withdrawals. I let out a broken, humorless laugh that sounded completely foreign to my own ears. I'm trying to pay for the oxygen machine that kept his father breathing yesterday. I'm trying to buy groceries so I can eat dinner tonight. I have $42 to my name, Richard. I gave up a lucrative career in supply chain management. I have no income. My father knows this. He's intentionally trying to starve me out of the house. I am truly sorry, Chloe, Richard said. And the absolute worst part was that he actually looked sorry, but not sorry enough to do the right thing. Not sorry enough to stand up to his wealthy golf buddy and question the morality of leaving a grieving caregiver penniless. I strongly suggest you speak with your father. I am sure this is just a tragic family misunderstanding. I am sure he will provide you with a reasonable stipend for your living expenses while you pack your things and transition out of the property. I stared at this man, this coward, in a designer suit and realized exactly how the world worked. The law did not care about who did the grueling, heartbreaking work. The law did not care about personal sacrifice or quiet loyalty or desperate love. The law only cared about pieces of paper with signatures on them. And my father had all the right pieces of paper. I snatched my useless debit card off his desk and turned away. I did not say goodbye. I walked out of the bank into the freezing wind, feeling completely and utterly defeated. My father had closed the steel trap around me, and the walls were rapidly closing in. I drove back to the house in a state of numb waking paralysis. The massive iron gates swung open automatically as I punched in the security code. The sprawling stone house looked identical to how it had yesterday, but it no longer felt like a warm sanctuary. It felt like a hostile territory. When I opened the heavy oak front door, I immediately heard loud, cheerful voices coming from the formal living room down the hall. I walked down the corridor, my boots echoing sharply on the polished marble floor. The formal living room had always been Grandpa Thomas' favorite place to read the morning paper. It was a beautiful room, filled with dark wood paneling, antique leather furniture, and tall shelves packed with classic literature and history books. But standing right in the center of the room was my sister-in-law, Jessica. She was holding a bright yellow tape measure, pulling it across the expanse of a beautiful Persian rug. A woman holding a clipboard, clearly an expensive interior designer, was standing next to her, nodding enthusiastically and taking rapid notes. Jessica looked up as I entered the room. She was wearing a pristine white cashmere sweater and designer leggings, looking effortlessly wealthy and perfectly manicured. She did not look like someone who had just lost a family member. She looked like someone who had just won the lottery and was eager to spend the jackpot. "Oh, good, you are back," Jessica said casually, letting the tape measure snap loudly back into its plastic casing. She gestured vaguely toward the corner of the room where Grandpa had kept his treasured collection of vintage vinyl records. "Listen, Chloe, my designer is thinking we need to bring in a massive amount of natural light. This whole room is incredibly depressing right now. It smells like old books and medical supplies. We are going to rip out these heavy velvet curtains, tear up this old rug, and paint everything a crisp, modern white. Maybe do a massive velvet sectional right in the middle." I stood there in the doorway, completely unable to formulate a rational response. She was already erasing him. He had been dead for less than 24 hours, and she was already planning her new aesthetic over his memory. "Since you are just hanging around the house today with nothing to do," Jessica continued, completely oblivious to my silence, or perhaps entirely indifferent to it, "could you start boxing up all those dusty books on the shelves? We need this entire room cleared out by Thursday so the painters can get in here and start priming the walls. And please make sure you use the heavy-duty moving boxes. I do not want the bottoms falling out and scratching up the hardwood floors before we have them refinished." She was speaking to me the exact same way she spoke to the teenage cashiers at the local boutique. She was giving me chores. She thought my eviction notice was simply a timeline for me to finish cleaning up the mess before she moved her expensive life into my space. She saw me as the unpaid help. I did not argue. I did not scream at her. I did not have a single ounce of energy left to fight with a woman whose entire personality and lifestyle was funded by my father and his bank account. I turned around and walked away without acknowledging a single word she said. I heard her scoff loudly behind me, muttering something to the designer about my terrible, ungrateful attitude, but I just kept walking. I went straight down the hall to Grandpa's private study and closed the solid wood door behind me, locking it with a sharp, definitive click. The study was exactly as he had left it weeks ago. His reading glasses were still sitting on the leather blotter of his massive mahogany desk. A half-empty glass of stale water sat next to a stack of financial journals he used to read before his vision failed. The room smelled deeply of his pipe tobacco and old paper. It was the only place in the entire world where I felt remotely safe. But the safety was a cruel illusion. The 30-day eviction notice my father had handed me the night before was sitting right on the center of the desk, a bright white reminder of my impending financial ruin. I walked over to the desk and picked up the paper. Pack your things, get a job, face the real world. My father's cold, mocking words echoed endlessly in my ears. I had $42. I could not afford first and last month rent on the cheapest apartment in the city. I could not afford a security deposit. I could not afford a moving truck to take my clothes. I was completely trapped. A wave of absolute crushing despair crashed over me, pulling me under. It was simply too much to bear. The profound grief of losing the only man who loved me, the calculated betrayal of my parents, the aggressive greed of my brother, the freezing of my bank accounts, the humiliating condescension of Jessica treating me like a maid. It all spiraled together into a tight, suffocating knot right in the center of my chest. I felt like I was going to scream until my vocal cords snapped. I slammed my hands down hard on the mahogany desk. I grabbed the formal 30-day notice, crumpled it into a tight, angry ball, and threw it violently across the room. I was breathing heavily tears of pure, unadulterated frustration, stinging my eyes and blurring my vision. I reached out blindly to grab the edge of the desk to steady my trembling legs, but my hand caught the side of Grandpa's heavy brass reading lamp. The lamp toppled over with a loud metallic crash, hitting the sharp edge of the desk before tumbling down onto the thick wool rug below. I froze my breath, catching painfully in my throat. The house was already quiet enough that Jessica might have heard the noise from the living room and come investigating. I knelt down quickly on the rug to pick it up, terrified that I had broken something irreplaceable that belonged to him. But as I lifted the heavy brass fixture from the floor, I noticed something incredibly strange. The bottom base of the lamp, which was normally covered by a smooth circle of green, felt to prevent scratching, had popped completely off upon impact with the floor. The heavy base was entirely hollow, and sitting inside the dark hidden cavity of the brass lamp resting against the cold metal was a small silver safety deposit box key attached to a faded red ribbon and a folded piece of thick stationery paper with my name written on it in his familiar shaky handwriting. The heavy brass lamp hit the thick Persian rug with a muted, heavy thud. I froze completely. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The house was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt dangerous. If Jessica heard the noise from the living room, she would come marching down the hallway to scold me for damaging her future property. I dropped to my knees on the floor, my hands trembling violently as I reached out to pick up the heavy fixture. I was terrified. I had broken the only object in this house that still smelled like my grandfather. But as I lifted the cold metal, I noticed something impossible. The bottom base of the lamp, the part that was usually covered by a circle of soft green felt to protect the mahogany desk, had popped entirely off from the impact. The heavy brass stand was completely hollow inside. I stared into the dark cavity of the metal base. Resting right there, taped against the cold brass, was a tiny silver safety deposit box key. It was attached to a faded red ribbon. Tucked beneath it was a small square of thick, cream-colored stationery. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely peel the tape away. I pulled the note and the key into my lap. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was my grandfather's script, shaky and uneven from the Parkinson's tremors, but pressed deep into the paper with absolute determination. Chloe, the note read, First National Downtown, Box 814. Let them think they won. I read those words 3 times. The letters blurred as tears filled my eyes, spilling over my eyelashes and dropping onto my worn sweater. He knew. My grandfather, the man who had struggled to lift his own teacup during his final months, had known exactly what my parents were planning. He had seen their greed. He had seen my father's calculated cruelty and my brother's boundless entitlement. He had watched them hovering around his illness like vultures, waiting for his heart to stop. And while they were busy underestimating him, while they were busy treating me like the invisible hired help, he had been quietly building a fortress to protect me. Before I could even process the magnitude of what I was holding, I heard the heavy, aggressive thud of footsteps marching down the hardwood hallway. "Hey, what are you doing in here?" The solid oak door swung open with a violent push. My brother Brandon stood in the doorway, his expensive Italian leather shoes planting firmly on the rug. He looked down at me, kneeling on the floor next to the dismantled lamp. His eyes narrowed with instant predatory suspicion. I had less than a second to react. I slapped my right hand flat against my thigh palm, palming the small silver key and the note deep into the sleeve of my oversized grey sweater. I scrambled to my feet, keeping my right arm pressed tightly against my side, and used my left hand to awkwardly set the brass lamp back onto the desk. I bumped the desk, I stammered. I forced my voice to sound small, defeated, and pathetic. It was the exact version of me that Brandon expected to see. I was just packing up the books like Jessica asked. "I am trying to get out of your way." Brandon scoffed, crossing his arms over his tailored suit jacket. He looked around the study, his eyes scanning the antique books and the leather furniture with pure greed. "You better be careful with that stuff, Chloe. That is all prime estate property now. Dad is having the appraisers come through tomorrow morning." He stepped further into the room, the scent of his overpriced cologne suffocating the comforting smell of Grandpa's pipe tobacco. "Anyway," he said, snapping his fingers at me as if I were a dog. "Give me the keys to the Mustang, the vintage 1968 Mustang." It was Grandpa's most prized possession, sitting under a tarp in the carriage house for the last 10 years. Brandon had been begging for that car since he was a teenager, and Grandpa had always refused, knowing Brandon would wrap it around a telephone pole or sell it to pay off his gambling debts. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. My right hand was sweating around the small metal key hidden in my sleeve. "The Mustang keys are in the top left drawer," I said quietly. "But Brandon, you might want to wait before you take it out." Brandon stopped halfway to the desk. He turned his head, glaring at me. "Excuse me, I do not need your permission to drive my own car." "It is not yours yet," I said, keeping my eyes firmly on the floor, playing the role of the subservient sister perfectly. "And I heard Dad talking on his phone this morning. He was on the phone with his investment broker. I think Dad is planning to liquidate the vintage cars immediately. He mentioned something about needing the cash to cover those bridge loans you took out for your failed tech startup last year. He said the Mustang alone would cover your outstanding business debts." I watched the color completely drain from Brandon's perfectly tanned face. I knew exactly where to strike. Brandon was drowning in debt, living entirely on credit cards. And our father's bailouts. The idea that his shiny new toy was going to be sold off by our father to pay for his past failures was his absolute worst nightmare. "He is selling it?" Brandon asked, his voice losing all its arrogant bravado. "He said he was giving it to me." I kept my eyes on the rug. "You know how Dad is with money, Brandon. He secures the assets first. If you want that car, you should probably go secure the title and the keys right now before he hands them over to the estate liquidator." Brandon did not say another word. The sheer panic of losing his inheritance overrode any suspicion he had about what I was doing in the study. He yanked the top drawer open, snatched the heavy ring of car keys, and sprinted out of the room. I listened to his heavy footsteps pounding down the hallway, shouting for our father. As soon as his voice faded into the distance, I collapsed against the heavy mahogany desk. My entire body was shaking. I opened my sweaty palm and looked at the silver key. Box 814, First National Downtown. I glanced up at the antique grandfather clock, ticking quietly in the corner of the study. It was exactly 4:20 in the afternoon. A fresh wave of panic hit me with the force of a physical blow. First National Downtown was a traditional bank. They closed their vault access at exactly 5 o'clock. I had exactly 40 minutes to get from the wealthy, quiet suburbs of Lake Forest all the way into downtown Chicago in the middle of a freezing Friday afternoon rainstorm. If I did not get into that box today, my father would have the entire weekend to use his fraudulent power of attorney to locate and freeze whatever hidden assets my grandfather had left me. By Monday morning, this key would be nothing but a useless piece of metal. I shoved the key and the note deep into the front pocket of my jeans. I grabbed my worn wool coat from the back of the leather reading chair. I had to get out of this house right now. But there was a massive problem. My car keys were sitting on the granite kitchen island, and the kitchen was currently occupied by my mother and Jessica, who were undoubtedly sipping wine and discussing upholstery fabrics. I crept down the hallway, keeping my back pressed against the expensive floral wallpaper. I could hear their voices echoing from the kitchen. "I just think white linen is so much more sophisticated," Jessica was saying, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The dark wood in this house is so depressing. It feels like a nursing home." I reached the edge of the kitchen doorway and peered around the corner. My mother was leaning against the counter holding a glass of Chardonnay. Jessica was standing by the refrigerator pointing at a catalog. My car keys were resting on the edge of the island, exactly 3 feet away from my mother's elbow. I closed my eyes and took a deep, silent breath. I channeled every ounce of strength I had left. I stepped out from the hallway and walked directly into the kitchen, moving with quick, deliberate purpose. Neither of them stopped talking. My mother glanced at me with an expression of mild annoyance, as if a stray dog had wandered into her pristine dining area. "I am going to the hardware store," I announced loudly, grabbing my keys off the counter in one swift motion. "Jessica wants me to pack up the heavy books, and I need to buy industrial moving boxes." My mother took a sip of her wine, barely looking at me. "Make sure you use your own money for those boxes, Chloe. Your father is monitoring the estate expenses very closely. We are not reimbursing you for packing supplies." I did not flinch. I did not argue. I just nodded, clutching my car keys so tightly the jagged metal bit into my palm. "I will be quick," I said. I turned and walked out the front door, stepping out into the freezing, punishing wind. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and the freezing rain was coming down in heavy, blinding sheets. I climbed into my 10-year-old car, shoved the key into the ignition, and threw it into drive. The tires spun on the wet gravel of the driveway before catching traction. I peeled out onto the main road, the windshield wipers slapping violently back and forth. I had exactly 34 minutes to beat the bank tellers, beat the storm, and beat the family that was trying to destroy me. The drive down the interstate into the heart of Chicago was a terrifying blur of red brake lights and blinding sleet. My knuckles were completely white against the steering wheel of my battered 10-year-old sedan. The car's heater was struggling, blowing a pathetic stream of lukewarm air that did absolutely nothing to chase away the bone-deep chill soaking through my damp wool coat. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed a mocking 4:37, then 4:41. The traffic was crawling at a miserable, agonizing pace. Every time the tires spun on the icy asphalt, a fresh wave of panic threatened to swallow me whole. I had less than 20 minutes to navigate the congested grid of the financial district, find a place to park, and cross the lobby of First National downtown before they locked their heavy brass doors for the weekend. I knew my father. I knew how ruthlessly efficient Robert could be when money was involved. If I did not get inside that bank vault today, he would use his fraudulent power of attorney to hunt down and freeze whatever my grandfather had left for me by Monday morning. I abandoned my car in a commercial loading zone 2 blocks away from the bank. I did not care if it was towed. I did not care about the parking tickets. I grabbed my purse and sprinted down the freezing sidewalk, slipping on patches of black ice, my breath tearing through my lungs like jagged glass. The towering stone facade of the bank loomed ahead, an intimidating fortress of old money and corporate power. Through the massive glass windows, I could see a uniformed security guard stepping forward, reaching out to grasp the brass handles of the main entrance. "Wait!" I screamed, my voice raw and desperate against the howling wind. "Please wait." I threw myself between the heavy doors just as they were swinging shut. The security guard jumped back in surprise, his hand dropping to his utility belt. I stood in the magnificent, echoing lobby, gasping for air, dripping freezing rain onto the pristine marble floor. I held up both hands in a gesture of surrender and pulled the small silver key from my pocket. "I have a safety deposit box." I panted, struggling to make my voice sound authoritative rather than hysterical. "I need to access the vault. It is an absolute emergency." The guard looked at the antique grandfather clock ticking on the far wall. It was exactly 4:56. He sighed heavily, a sound of deep corporate exhaustion, and pointed toward a frosted glass door at the back of the lobby. "You have 4 minutes before the vault timer automatically engages," he said firmly. "If you are not out by 5 o'clock, you will be locked in there until Monday." I did not waste a single second thanking him. I ran past the teller counters, my wet boots squeaking loudly against the polished stone, and pushed through the frosted glass door. The vault custodian was an older woman with sharp eyes and a severe grey bob. She looked at my disheveled appearance with clear disapproval, but when I slapped the silver key onto her counter and slapped my state identification card right next to it, her professional training took over. She verified my signature on a thick ledger, retrieved her own master key, and led me into the belly of the bank. The vault was freezing. It smelled of ozone old paper and polished steel. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of identical rectangular metal doors. We walked down a narrow echoing aisle until she stopped in front of box 814. She inserted her master key into the left lock. I inserted my grandfather's silver key into the right lock. We turned them simultaneously. The heavy internal mechanism shifted with a loud, satisfying metallic clunk. The custodian pulled the long metal container from the wall, handed it to me without a word, and pointed to a small private viewing booth in the corner of the room. "You have 2 minutes," she warned. I carried the metal box into the tiny booth and closed the privacy curtain. My hands were shaking so violently that I nearly dropped the container onto the small laminate table. I did not know what I was expecting to find. A part of me, the desperate, broke, terrified part of me, was praying for neat stacks of $100 bills. I needed money to survive. I needed cash to fight the 30-day eviction notice sitting on my grandfather's desk. I flipped the hinged lid open. The box was entirely empty of currency. There were no gold coins, no bearer bonds, no stacks of emergency cash. Instead, resting alone against the cold metal bottom was a thick sealed manila envelope. I tore the heavy paper open my fingernails, scraping against the flap. 3 items spilled out onto the table. The first was a small black computer flash drive. The second was a pristine, legally bound document housed in a heavy blue cover, the pages thick and untouched. The third was a heavy cream-colored business card with embossed black lettering. William Sterling, attorney at law. There was a phone number and an address in the suburbs, but no corporate logo, no flashy firm name. Just the man and his contact information. A sharp knock on the wooden frame of the viewing booth made me jump. "Time is up," the custodian announced through the curtain. "The vault is locking." I shoved the items deep into my purse, shoved the empty metal box back into its slot, and practically ran out of the vault just as the massive steel door began its slow, automated pivot closed. I was back in the main lobby a moment later, surrounded by tellers who were shutting down their stations and turning off their monitors. I could not wait until I got home. I could not go back to that house without knowing what my grandfather had left me. I approached a woman closing up her desk near the loan department. She had kind eyes and a framed photograph of 2 golden retrievers on her desk. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep the frantic edge out of my voice. "I know you are closing. I know this is highly irregular, but I just lost my grandfather yesterday, and I retrieved a flash drive from his vault. I have absolutely no access to a computer right now. I just need to plug this in for 5 minutes. Please, I just need to see his final message." The woman looked at my red, swollen eyes, my soaking wet clothes, and the sheer unfiltered desperation radiating from my entire body. She looked around to ensure the branch manager was not watching, then quietly turned her laptop screen toward me. "Make it quick," she whispered gently. I pulled a chair close to her desk, my hands trembling as I pushed the small black drive into the side of her computer. A folder popped up on the screen. Inside was a single high-definition video file titled, "Simply for Chloe." I clicked play. The media player opened, expanding to fill the screen. The image was crystal clear, professionally recorded with perfect lighting. And suddenly, there he was, my grandfather Thomas. But this was not the frail, bruised, agonizingly thin man whose hand I had held as he took his final breath yesterday. This was my grandfather from at least 2 years ago. He was sitting in his favorite leather armchair in his study. He was wearing his gray tweed jacket. His face was full, his eyes were sharp and bright, and he looked straight into the camera lens with an expression of absolute terrifying clarity. "Hello, Chloe," my grandfather said. Hearing his voice strong and resonant and completely free of the tremors that had ravaged his final months broke something deep inside my chest. A ragged sob escaped my throat. I pressed my hand over my mouth to muffle the sound, tears spilling hot and fast down my freezing cheeks. "If you are watching this," he continued, leaning forward slightly in his chair, "it means I am gone. It also means you found the key exactly where I hid it, and it means you were smart enough to get to the bank before your father could stop you. I always knew you were the smartest person in our family, Chloe. You just never let them see it. He paused, a sad, weary smile crossing his face. I am recording this because I need you to know the absolute truth, and I need a legal record of my state of mind. I am perfectly lucid. I know exactly what day it is, I know exactly what I am doing, and I know exactly what Robert and Brandon are planning to do the moment my heart stops beating. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath catching. Your father thinks I am a fool, my grandfather said, his voice hardening, the warmth vanishing completely. Robert believes that because my body is failing, my mind is failing with it. He believes I do not see him pacing around this house calculating the value of my antique furniture. He thinks I do not know about the bridge loans he has taken out to fund Brandon's completely useless failed startup companies. They are sitting around waiting for me to die, Chloe. They look at me, and they do not see a father or a grandfather. They see a winning lottery ticket. He took a deep breath, his hands resting firmly on the arms of his chair. They have spent the last 6 years treating you like a servant. They forced you to abandon your brilliant career in supply chain logistics. They isolated you, they drained your savings, and they told you it was your duty. I allowed it to happen, and for that, I will be sorry for the rest of eternity. I let you bear the burden of my care because I was selfish and because you were the only one who ever looked at me with genuine love. But I did not sit by and do nothing. While you were keeping me alive, I was building a trap for the men who abandoned us both. The screen flickered slightly as he shifted his weight. I reached out and touched the edge of the laptop monitor, wishing desperately that I could reach through the glass and hold him one last time. Robert believes that my entire estate is worth roughly $13 million. My grandfather explained, his tone shifting into something clinical and precise. He thinks it is tied up in standard stock portfolios and the equity of the house. He thinks the power of attorney document he bullied me into signing in 2015 gives him the absolute right to freeze your accounts and evict you the second I am gone. He is wrong. My grandfather leaned closer to the camera, his eyes burning with an intense protective fire. The money is not just from old stock investments, Chloe. 10 years ago, long before the Parkinson's diagnosis, I developed a specialized pneumatic valve mechanism for industrial shipping containers. I patented it quietly. I sold the licensing rights to a major global logistics firm. The payout was staggering, and I buried it deep in a blind trust that Robert's corporate lawyers could never trace. I kept it completely hidden because I knew if your father found out about that kind of liquid capital, he would destroy our family trying to get his hands on it. I stared at the screen, completely paralyzed. A secret patent, millions of dollars hidden in the shadows. He had known all along what my father was capable of. He had seen the rot inside our family tree, and he had systematically planned around it. I drafted a completely new last will and testament, my grandfather said, gesturing to a blue document sitting on the table next to him, in the video identical to the one currently sitting in my purse. I had it drawn up recently. I was evaluated by 3 independent neurological specialists who signed sworn affidavits confirming I am of completely sound mind. The will you have in your envelope legally revokes the 2015 document your father is holding. He paused, and the protective fire in his eyes softened into a look of profound, unconditional love. I left everything to you, Chloe. Every single penny. The house, the trusts, the vintage cars, the patent royalties. It is all yours. You are the only one who earned it. You are the only one who actually understands the meaning of sacrifice. A fresh wave of tears blinded me. I wiped them away furiously, terrified of missing a single word. But you are going to have to fight for it, he warned, his voice turning urgent, dropping into a serious commanding register. Robert will not surrender $13 million without a bloodbath. He will bring an army of expensive lawyers to the probate court. He will try to claim you manipulated a dying man. He will try to destroy your character. That is why you cannot do this alone, and that is why you cannot use a regular attorney. He pointed directly at the camera lens. Inside that envelope is a business card for a man named William Sterling. He's the attorney who helped me draft this new will. He's brilliant, he's ruthless, and he has a very personal reason for wanting to see your father's lawyers humiliated in open court. You must find him, Chloe. You have to find William Sterling before the official probate hearing on the 14th. If your father's fraudulent power of attorney is certified by the judge on that day, he will immediately drain the blind trust and hide the assets offshore. You will be left with absolutely nothing, and they will walk away clean. The video began to fade at the edges. My grandfather offered one final brave smile. I love you, Chloe. I am so incredibly proud of the woman you are. Do not let them intimidate you. Do not let them make you feel small ever again. Let them think they have won. Let them spend money they do not have, and then you burn their kingdom to the ground. The video cut to pitch black. I sat frozen in the middle of the quiet bank, the silence rushing back into my ears. The loan officer beside me was staring at the blank screen, her hand covering her mouth in shock. She had heard every word. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and profound respect. You need to take that drive, she whispered fiercely, pushing the laptop toward me. You need to take that drive, and you need to go ruin them. I pulled the black flash drive from the port. I dropped it securely into my purse, right next to the blue legal document and the heavy business card. I thanked her, my voice remarkably steady, stripped of all the panic that had consumed me 30 minutes ago. The grief was still there, sitting heavy in my chest, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had been forged into something hard, sharp, and incredibly dangerous. My grandfather had not just left me money, he had left me a loaded weapon, and he had given me explicit permission to pull the trigger. I walked out of the bank and stepped back into the freezing Chicago storm. The sleet was still coming down in heavy, punishing sheets, but I barely felt the cold. I climbed into the driver's seat of my frozen car and locked the doors. The clock on my dashboard read 5:18. I pulled the heavy cream-colored business card from my purse. William Sterling, attorney at law. The probate hearing was scheduled for the 14th. Today was Friday the 10th. I had exactly 4 days to locate this man, convince him to take on my father's corporate legal team, and spring the trap my grandfather had spent years building. I turned on the overhead dome light. I pulled out my cell phone, my thumbs moving quickly over the cold glass screen. I dialed the local area code, followed by the 7 digits printed in elegant black ink on the card. I pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the silence on the line, waiting for the ring, waiting for the voice of the man who was going to help me execute my vengeance. The line clicked. A sharp, mechanical tone echoed in my ear, followed immediately by an automated, cheerful, completely devastating voice. We are sorry, but the number you have reached is no longer in service. Please check the number and try your call again. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the screen. I dialed the numbers a second time, pressing each digit deliberately, ensuring I had made no mistakes. The exact same mechanical voice greeted me. The number was dead. It was disconnected. It was completely useless. The crushing realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I was sitting in a freezing car with exactly $42 to my name, holding a flash drive and a piece of paper that made me a multi-millionaire, but without an attorney to authenticate the will. Before the judge on Tuesday morning, the documents were nothing but expensive trash. My father had a team of slick, ruthless corporate sharks ready to devour the estate, and my only lifeline, the brilliant, ruthless lawyer my grandfather had promised would save me, had seemingly vanished off the face of the earth. The trap was set, but the jaws were jammed, and the clock was ticking down to my absolute ruin. I was sitting in my freezing car in the bank parking lot, staring at a disconnected phone number on a cream-colored business card. The crushing weight of the dead dial tone felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I had exactly 4 days until the probate hearing on Tuesday morning. 4 days until my father Robert walked into a courtroom, waved that fraudulent 2015 power of attorney, and legally stole $13 million that my grandfather had intended for me. If I did not have legal representation by that morning, the judge would gavel the estate directly into my parents' greedy hands. I could not afford to panic. Panic is a luxury for people who have a financial safety net to fall back on. I had $42 to my name and a 30-day eviction notice waiting for me back at the house. I took a deep, shuddering breath, gripped the steering wheel, and forced my exhausted brain to shift gears. Before I gave up my life to be an unpaid caregiver, I was a regional supply chain manager. My entire professional career was built on tracking missing cargo, unraveling complex corporate shipping webs, and locating valuable assets that were intentionally hidden across the country. In the world of global logistics, absolutely nothing truly vanishes. Every movement leaves a paper trail. Every transaction leaves a digital footprint. William Sterling was not a ghost. He was simply a missing asset, and I was going to find him. I drove away from the downtown financial district and found a cheap 24-hour diner on the edge of the city limits. I used 3 of my precious remaining dollars to buy a black coffee just so I could use their free wireless internet. I sat in a sticky vinyl booth in the back corner, opened my laptop, and went to work. I could not do this research at the estate because I knew my brother Brandon had likely already changed the home network passwords to lock me out. I started by running William Sterling through the State Bar Association database. His legal license was still completely active. There were no disciplinary actions on his record, no malpractice suits, and no disbarment proceedings. But his registered mailing address was a post office box that had been closed over 6 months ago. The official narrative floating around the corporate internet forums was that he had simply retired to enjoy his golden years. But I knew exactly how corporate predators like my father and his wealthy friends operated. You do not just quietly retire in your early 60s when you are managing high net worth estates and bringing in millions in billable hours. You are pushed. I started digging deeper into the public records. I cross-referenced property tax databases in Cook County, looking for any commercial leases signed under his name or any limited liability company associated with him. I found absolutely nothing in the city center. I pivoted my strategy. I looked up his old prestigious law firm. I dug through 2 years of press releases and corporate announcements. I found a brief, highly sanitized statement from 2022 announcing Sterling's abrupt departure to pursue personal interests. It was the kind of vague corporate speak that always hides a scandal. I scrolled down the firm's timeline. Exactly 2 weeks after Sterling was removed, there was a massive announcement celebrating that my father's investment group had just retained that exact same firm as their primary legal counsel. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together with sickening clarity. My father and his country club associates had not just hired a new law firm. They had orchestrated a deliberate targeted smear campaign. They had leveraged their massive corporate retainers to force Sterling out of his own partnership. They buried him in quiet rumors, professional isolation, and intense financial pressure simply because he was too honest to facilitate their shady asset transfers. They ruined his reputation to silence him before my grandfather passed away. But a man who keeps his state bar license active is not a man who has surrendered completely. He is a man sitting in exile waiting for a chance to strike back. I expanded my search radius dramatically. I moved away from the wealthy downtown commercial districts and started scanning suburban property tax records. I looked for cheap commercial leases, the kind of places that did not require a massive corporate guarantor or a pristine credit score. I tracked utility setups and business registrations through a labyrinth of public county websites. 4 hours later, my eyes burning from staring at the bright screen in the dim diner, I found it. A tiny holding company registered to a W. Sterling was paying the monthly lease on a small office space in a dying strip mall 40 miles outside the city. I slammed my laptop shut, grabbed my keys, and walked out into the freezing rain. I drove for over an hour, leaving the manicured lawns, massive iron gates, and pristine streets of my father's wealthy neighborhood far behind me. The suburb I finally arrived in was a graveyard of abandoned retail stores and potholed streets. I pulled into a cracked asphalt parking lot that was mostly empty. The strip mall featured a discount liquor store with barred windows, a failing laundromat smelling of bleach, and at the very far end of the building, a faded glass door. Taped to the inside of the glass was a cheap plastic sign with peeling letters. William Sterling, attorney at law. It was a devastating fall from grace. It was a far cry from the mahogany desks, marble floors, and sweeping city views of his former life. The air outside smelled of wet concrete and exhaust fumes. I pushed the heavy glass door open. A small brass bell chimed weakly above my head. The reception area was completely empty. There was no secretary, no waiting music, just a cheap laminate desk covered in stacks of unopened mail and legal files gathering dust. The air inside was stale and heavy. From a back room down a short, dark hallway, a man's gruff voice called out, "We are closed for the weekend. Come back on Monday if you have an appointment." I did not turn around. I did not leave. I walked straight past the empty reception desk, my wet boots squeaking against the cheap linoleum floor, and stepped directly into the open doorway of his private office. William Sterling was sitting behind a battered metal desk, overflowing with paperwork. He looked absolutely nothing like the polished, sharp, ruthless lawyer my grandfather had described in his video. He looked thoroughly exhausted. He was in his early 60s, wearing a wrinkled dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows and a loosened tie. His face was lined with deep exhaustion, and his eyes were surrounded by dark, heavy circles, the kind that only come from years of carrying profound stress and bitter regret. He looked up from a stack of manila folders, clearly annoyed by the intrusion. "I told you the office is closed," he said sharply, taking off his reading glasses and tossing them onto the metal desk with a clatter. "I am not looking for a free consultation," I replied. My voice was remarkably steady, despite the adrenaline pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "I am Thomas's granddaughter. My name is Chloe." The name hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The casual annoyance vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a harsh defensive bitterness that hardened his features. He leaned back in his squeaky office chair and crossed his arms tightly over his chest, studying me with cynical, guarded eyes. "I know exactly who you are," he said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register dripping with tired resentment. "And I know exactly who your father is. Robert Myers is a corporate shark who destroys everything he touches. He and his country club friends dismantled my entire life. They spread vicious rumors that I was mishandling client trust funds. They threatened to pull millions of dollars in billable hours from my old firm unless the managing partners threw me out on the street. They blacklisted me from every major legal practice in Chicago. I lost my firm, I lost my pension, I lost my marriage over the stress of the bankruptcy. So if you are standing in my office looking for a miracle to save your inheritance, you have driven to the wrong address. I have absolutely nothing left to give your family." I stood my ground. I did not shrink back, and I did not apologize. For 6 years, I had made myself small to avoid my father's wrath. I was done shrinking. "My grandfather told me you were brilliant," I said, taking a deliberate step closer to his messy desk. "He told me you were ruthless. He told me you were the only person in this entire state who could stop my father from stealing his legacy." Sterling let out a harsh, humorless laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. Thomas was an incredible man, but he was a stubborn optimist. He underestimated the absolute lack of morality in your father's world. Your father has an army of expensive, slick corporate lawyers, ready to walk into that probate court on Tuesday morning. They will bury you in emergency motions. They will drain whatever little money you have left in endless legal fees. They will crush you, Chloe, just like they crushed me. Go home. Walk away while you still have your sanity. Let them have the money. It is not worth the blood they will demand from you to fight them. "I am not walking away," I said. My voice rose vibrating with the same fierce protective anger that had carried me through the freezing storm. "They have already taken everything from me. They took my career. They took my 20s. I wiped him, bathed him, and kept him alive for 6 years while my brother blew through venture capital money. And they handed me a 30-day eviction notice the exact moment his heart stopped beating. I have $42 in my checking account and absolutely nothing left to lose. But I have this." I reached deep into my purse, pulled out the small black flash drive I had taken from the safety deposit box and slammed it down onto the center of his metal desk. The sharp smack of plastic against metal echoed loudly in the small, dusty room. Sterling stared at the drive, his jaw tight with suspicion. "What is that?" he asked, not moving a muscle. "It is my grandfather," I said, pointing a shaking finger at the desk. "It is his final message. Watch it." He hesitated for a long moment. He looked up at my face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint that I was playing one of my father's elaborate, cruel games. But all he saw was a woman standing in soaking wet clothes who was absolutely desperate for justice. He slowly reached out, picked up the small black drive, plugged it into his ancient desktop computer, and clicked play. The small, dingy office was suddenly filled with my grandfather's strong, resonant voice. Sterling sat frozen in his chair, watching the high-definition video on his monitor in total, unbroken silence. I stood perfectly still and watched his face. I watched the heavy, cynical exhaustion slowly melt away from his features. I watched his posture change, his spine straightening against the back of the cheap office chair. As my grandfather's voice echoed through the room, explaining the secret industrial patent sale, the millions of dollars hidden safely in a blind trust, and the calculated, brilliant legal trap he had spent years building for my parents. Sterling's eyes began to narrow. The bitter, defeated man who had been hiding in this suburban strip mall was disappearing right in front of me. In his place, I saw the brilliant, predatory attorney my grandfather had trusted with his life's work. A sharp, dangerous, incredibly focused light sparked in his dark eyes. When the video finally ended and the computer screen cut to pitch black, the silence in the room was thick and electric with unspoken tension. Sterling did not say a single word at first. He slowly reached forward and unplugged the flash drive, his hands perfectly steady now. He stood up from his chair, turned his back to me, and walked over to a heavy iron safe sitting in the dark corner of his office. He spun the combination dial with practiced precision. The heavy metal door creaked open with a loud groan. He reached deep inside and pulled out a pristine, legally bound document housed in a heavy blue cover. He walked back to the metal desk and dropped the heavy document right in front of me. It was the original, fully notarized, 2023 Last Will and Testament of Thomas Myers. The signatures of 3 independent neurological specialists were clearly visible on the very first page, certifying his absolute mental clarity. Sterling looked across the desk at me, and for the first time since I had walked into his depressing office, he smiled. It was not a warm, comforting smile. It was the terrifying, predatory smile of a wolf that had just caught the scent of blood on the wind. "All right, Chloe," Sterling said. His voice was low, smooth, and thrumming with dangerous anticipation. "Let us let your family hang themselves. We are not going to say a single word to anyone until Tuesday morning. We need them to feel invincible. We need them to spend that money before they legally have it." The drive back to the estate in Lake Forest felt like crossing an invisible boundary line between my past and my future. The freezing rain was still coming down in heavy sheets against the windshield of my 10-year-old sedan. The heater rattled weakly against the dashboard, but I barely registered the cold air biting at my damp clothes. Inside my purse, resting on the passenger seat, was the small black flash drive containing my grandfather's final message and the heavy blue folder holding his true last will and testament. I had just left the dusty suburban office of William Sterling. I had secured my legal representation. I had the weapon I needed to destroy the people who were trying to destroy me. But as I pulled through the massive wrought iron gates of the property, I knew the most difficult part of the war was just beginning. William Sterling had been incredibly clear about our strategy. We needed my parents and my brother to feel absolutely invincible. We needed them to believe they had already won, so they would spend money they did not legally have. I had to go back inside that house and play the role of the defeated, submissive daughter one last time. I parked my car near the detached garage, wiped the rainwater from my face, and forced my shoulders to slump. I arranged my features into a mask of total despair. When I walked through the heavy front doors, the atmosphere in the house was completely suffocating. It had been less than 4 days since my grandfather took his final breath in his hospice bed, but the house no longer felt like a place of mourning. It felt like a corporate celebration, because my father, Robert, held that fraudulent 2015 power of attorney. He believed he had absolute uncontested access to a $13 million fortune. My family was losing their minds with greed. I walked toward the kitchen and stopped in the hallway, listening to the sound of my mother, Cynthia. She was sitting at the massive granite island with a crystal glass of expensive white wine in her hand. She was surrounded by glossy travel brochures and printed itineraries. She did not even look up when I walked into the room. She simply pointed her manicured finger toward a sink full of dirty dishes and told me to make myself useful. I turned on the hot water and plunged my hands into the soap, keeping my head down while I listened to her talk on speakerphone with a luxury travel agent. I stood there, scrubbing plates, while my own mother booked a $40,000 first-class Mediterranean cruise. She laughed brightly into the phone, discussing the private balcony suites and the exclusive shore excursions in Italy and Greece. She gave the agent a credit card number to pay the massive non-refundable deposit. She was spending her father-in-law's death money before his memorial service was even scheduled. I washed the dishes in absolute silence, letting the warm water run over my cracked skin, knowing that every dollar she put on that credit card was a dollar she would never be able to pay back. But my mother's cruise was just a small fraction of the financial disaster they were building. My father was a man who understood corporate leverage, or at least he fully believed he did. He knew the legal probate process would take a few weeks to officially transfer the massive stock portfolios and the real estate deeds into his name. But he and my golden child brother Brandon simply could not wait that long. The phantom money was burning a hole in their pockets. Later that afternoon, while I was polishing the antique wooden banister in the main hallway, I overheard my father making a phone call in my grandfather's study. I kept my breathing shallow and listened through the partially open door. My father was pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug, loudly negotiating a massive bridge loan with a private high-risk lending firm. I knew about bridge loans from my former career as a supply chain financial analyst. They were incredibly predatory financial instruments. They carried exorbitant, unforgiving interest rates designed to trap desperate borrowers. My father was using the presumed $13 million estate as direct collateral to borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars in advance cash. He was so arrogant, so completely blinded by his own greed and his absolute certainty that the 2015 will was bulletproof that he was eagerly signing his own financial death warrant. I wiped down the banister and smiled down at the polishing cloth. The absolute pinnacle of their delusion arrived the very next morning. I was carrying a heavy load of cardboard moving boxes out to the recycling bin when I heard the unmistakable aggressive roar of a high-performance engine. A large flatbed delivery truck pulled into the circular driveway. Sitting on the back of the truck was a brand new custom-ordered Porsche. It was a stunning shade of metallic gray with bright red brake calipers. Brandon walked out the front door wearing designer sunglasses and a smug, self-satisfied grin that made my stomach turn. He signed the delivery paperwork on the driver's clipboard without even reading the fine print. He had used a massive chunk of our father's high-interest bridge loan to finance a $120,000 sports car. My sister-in-law, Jessica, was right behind him. She was holding her phone up high, recording the entire delivery process for her social media accounts. I stood quietly by the garage door, holding a flattened cardboard box, while she posed against the hood of the luxury car, tossing her hair and blowing kisses to the camera. I watched her type out a long, boastful caption on Instagram. She wrote a paragraph about how the universe finally rewards good people who wait their turn about generational wealth, and about how she and Brandon were finally getting the lifestyle they truly deserved. She posted it without a single ounce of shame. They were living in a temporary fantasy world built on a stolen foundation, and they were furnishing that world with toxic predatory debt. Every single dollar they spent, every luxury contract they signed, every status symbol they flaunted was just another nail in their legal coffin. I watched them celebrate their stolen wealth, and I felt nothing but cold, patient anticipation. The tension in the house finally culminated on Monday evening. It was the night before the scheduled probate court hearing, where my father expected the judge to officially grant him the estate. My mother had decided we needed to have a formal family dinner to celebrate their impending legal victory. She did not hire a private caterer. She did not order food from a high-end restaurant in the city. She ordered me to cook the dinner. She handed me a long grocery list and told me to prepare a full traditional roast beef dinner exactly like the ones I used to spend hours cooking for my grandfather on holidays. She wanted to sit at the head of the formal dining table and watch me serve them. It was a calculated power play, plain and simple. She wanted to break whatever tiny fraction of spirit I had left before they officially evicted me from the property the next morning. I stood in the hot kitchen for 4 solid hours. I roasted the heavy cut of beef. I chopped the root vegetables. I stood over the stove stirring the gravy from scratch while my feet ached. I let the heat of the oven warm my tired face while I listened to their loud, obnoxious laughter echoing down the hallway from the formal dining room. They were drinking expensive vintage champagne my father had saved for a special occasion. They were loudly discussing which high-end contractors they were going to hire to completely gut my grandfather's beautiful historic house. Brandon was bragging about the top speed of his new Porsche, complaining that the leather steering wheel needed to be broken in. Jessica was talking about hiring a full-time live-in nanny so she could focus entirely on her personal wellness journey. My father was holding court at the head of the table, basking in the artificial glow of his newfound empire. I carried the heavy silver serving platters into the dining room. I placed the steaming food on the table. The crystal chandeliers cast a harsh, glittering light over the room, reflecting of the expensive china. No one offered to help me carry the heavy dishes. No one paused their conversation to thank me for preparing the meal. I was completely invisible to them, a ghost haunting their celebration. I took my assigned seat at the very far end of the long table, right next to the swinging kitchen door. It was the children's seat, the servant's seat. I put a small portion of vegetables on my porcelain plate and stared down at my lap, waiting for the final act of their performance to begin. Halfway through the meal, my father set down his heavy silver fork. He wiped his mouth with a crisp linen napkin and reached into the interior breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. The entire table went completely silent. My mother smiled a tight, vicious little smile and took a slow sip of her champagne. Brandon leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, swirling the pale wine in his glass, watching me like I was a rat trapped in a maze. My father pulled out a crisp, folded piece of official bank paper. He held it between his index and middle finger, looking down the length of the long mahogany table directly at me. "Chloe," my father said. His voice was smooth, patronizing, and dripping with a thick layer of false sympathy. "Your mother and I have been discussing your current situation. We know tomorrow is going to be a very difficult day for you at the courthouse when the judge officially transfers the entire estate to me. We know you do not have a career to return to. We know you do not have any personal savings left. We want to be reasonable about this transition. We do not want to see our own daughter out on the street." He tossed the piece of paper down the table. It slid smoothly across the polished wood surface and stopped right next to my water glass. I looked down at it. It was a certified cashier's check made out to my legal name. The printed amount was for exactly $5,000. $5,000, a fraction of a percent of what my grandfather had actually left behind. $5,000 for 6 years of back-breaking unpaid medical care. $5,000 for giving up my promising career, my beautiful apartment, and the best years of my 20s. It was not a lifeline. It was a final, calculated insult designed to make him feel generous while leaving me destitute. "Consider it a little severance package," my father mocked, his eyes glinting with absolute cruelty. "It is more than enough to put down a security deposit on a cheap studio apartment somewhere outside the city limits. It will keep you fed while you register with a local temp agency and face the real world." I did not touch the piece of paper. I kept my hands resting quietly in my lap. I looked up at him. "Is that right?" I asked. My voice was very quiet, barely above a whisper. "Yes," my father replied, leaning his elbows on the table and interlacing his fingers. "But it comes with one standard corporate condition. I have a non-disclosure agreement and a legal waiver drafted by my attorneys. You will sign a document stating that you accept this money as a final settlement for your caregiving services and that you will not attempt to contest the 2015 will in probate court tomorrow morning. You sign the paper, you keep your mouth shut, and you can take the $5,000. If you refuse, I will cancel this check right now and you will walk out of the courthouse tomorrow with absolutely nothing to your name." My mother took another sip of her champagne. "Take the money, Chloe," she said dismissively, not even looking at me. "It is the best deal you are ever going to get in your life. Do not be stubborn and stupid." Brandon laughed out loud. "Come on, sis," he sneered, cutting a piece of the roast beef I had just cooked for him. $5,000 is a lot of money for someone with zero marketable skills. Take the handout and go pack your bags. For 6 years, I had swallowed my pride. For 6 years, I had looked at the floor, apologized for things I did not do, and absorbed their constant abuse because I was terrified of losing access to the only man in this family who truly loved me. But my grandfather was gone. I did not have to protect him from their cruelty anymore, and I certainly did not have to protect them from the consequences of their own actions. I looked at the $5,000 check sitting on the table. Then I looked at my brother, who was deeply in debt for a luxury sports car he could not afford to insure. I looked at my mother, who had booked a European cruise with a credit card she could not pay off. I looked at my father, who had leveraged a $13 million ghost estate to borrow cash from ruthless private lenders who would destroy his life when he defaulted. They were sitting on top of a massive financial landmine, and they had just handed me the detonator. I reached out with my right hand, I placed my index finger on the edge of the crisp bank check. I did not pick it up. I slowly, deliberately slid the check back across the polished mahogany table. It stopped right in the center, resting next to the heavy silver serving platter. Then I looked directly into my father's eyes, and I smiled. It was not a sad smile. It was not a submissive smile. It was a smile that carried the terrifying weight of a brilliant, ruthless trap waiting to snap shut. "Keep your severance package, Robert," I said. My voice was no longer quiet. It was sharp, clear, and ringing with absolute authority. My father frowned, his patronizing mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me," he snapped, his face flushing with sudden anger. I stood up from the table. I did not clear my plate. I did not ask to be excused. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "I said, keep your money," I repeated, looking down at the people who had treated me like a servant for half a decade. "You're going to need every single penny of it to pay off the interest on those bridge loans you took out yesterday." My father's face went completely pale. The glass of champagne in Brandon's hand stopped moving halfway to his mouth. My mother dropped her silver fork onto her china plate with a loud, sharp clatter. They stared at me, completely paralyzed, entirely unable to comprehend how the quiet, broken maid knew about their secret financial dealings. I did not give them a single chance to speak. I did not give them a chance to recover their composure. I turned around and walked toward the dining room doors. I stopped in the archway, looking back at their stunned, terrified faces one last time. "I am not signing your waiver," I said into the heavy silence. "And I am not packing my bags. Enjoy your dinner. I will see you all in court tomorrow morning." I walked out of the room, leaving the rejected check on the table and the war officially out in the open. The morning of the probate hearing was bitterly cold. The wind swept off the frozen lake and cut through the thin wool of my coat as I walked up the wide concrete steps of the county courthouse. I had arrived over an hour early because the anxiety building inside my chest made it absolutely impossible to sit still in my car. The courthouse lobby was a massive cavern of polished marble and echoing footsteps. It smelled of floor-wax stale coffee and institutional despair. I found my way to the third floor and took a seat on a hard wooden bench outside courtroom number 4. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to sit on them to keep them still. I had not heard a single word from William Sterling since I left his small, dusty suburban office 4 days ago. He had taken the flash drive and the secret 2023 will lock them safely in his iron safe and told me to wait. He promised he would meet me here. But as the wall clock ticked past 8:45, the crushing weight of doubt began to suffocate me. What if my father had discovered Sterling was representing me? What if my father had used his corporate connections to threaten the man again? What if Sterling had simply taken a look at my father's massive legal team and decided the fight was too risky? At exactly 9:15, the brass doors of the main elevator slid open. My family did not simply arrive at the courthouse. They made a grand theatrical entrance designed to intimidate anyone standing in their path. My father, Robert, led the procession. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than my entire net worth. He walked with the arrogant, unbothered stride of a man who owned the building. Flanking him were 3 tall men carrying thick leather briefcases. These were the high-priced, ruthless corporate litigators my father had hired to ensure my complete destruction. Behind the legal team walked my mother, Cynthia. She was draped in a tailored camel coat, wearing dark sunglasses indoors, and clutching a designer handbag that cost more than a month of my grandfather's hospice care. And bringing up the rear were my brother Brandon and his wife Jessica. They were not acting like a family preparing to settle the estate of a beloved patriarch. They were acting like tourists waiting to board a luxury cruise ship. They stopped a few yards away from the courtroom doors. They did not even acknowledge my presence, sitting alone on the wooden bench. They treated me like a piece of broken furniture they had already decided to throw away. I sat in perfect silence and listened to Brandon and Jessica talking. Their voices echoed loudly and carelessly off the marble walls. Brandon was laughing, scrolling through something on his expensive smartphone. "It is a highly rated local contractor," Brandon said loudly, showing the screen to his wife. "He says he can have a full demolition crew at the estate by Friday morning. We are going to completely rip out all that depressing dark wood paneling in this study." Jessica smiled brightly and leaned her head against his shoulder. I want the entire ground floor to be an open concept, she said, gesturing with her manicured hands. And we absolutely have to tear up those old Persian rugs today. They smell like sickness and old age. I want crisp white Italian tile everywhere. I sat there, gripping the edge of the wooden bench until my fingers ached. They were standing outside a courtroom, laughing about destroying the exact room where my grandfather had spent his entire life. They wanted to tear down his history, erase his memory, and paint over his legacy with cold, sterile white tile. They were talking about the house they had stolen using predatory bridge loans and fraudulent paperwork. My mother noticed me looking at them. She did not look away. Instead, she offered a small, vicious, calculating smile. She adjusted her expensive coat, leaned closer to my father, and whispered something in his ear. My father barely glanced in my direction. He turned his attention to his lead attorney, a tall man with slicked-back silver hair and a predatory gaze. "We want the eviction enforced immediately today," my father instructed the lawyer, his voice sharp and demanding. "I want her removed from the property by sunset. I do not want her spending another night under my roof." The lawyer nodded smoothly, snapping his briefcase shut. "Consider it done, Robert. She will be gone by 5 o'clock. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom were finally unlocked by a uniformed bailiff. We all filed inside. The courtroom was designed to make you feel incredibly small. It featured massive high ceilings, rows of heavy, polished wooden benches, and the judge's bench looming at the very front of the room like an intimidating fortress of absolute authority. I walked slowly down the center aisle and took my seat at the plaintiff table on the right side of the room. I sat completely alone. I placed my purse on the floor and folded my hands on the empty mahogany table. Across the wide aisle at the respondent table, my father took his seat surrounded by his formidable legal team. The lawyers immediately began pulling out thick stacks of documents, organizing their files, and whispering strategies. Brandon, Jessica, and my mother sat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind my father. They looked like a royal family waiting patiently for their official coronation. The air in the room was thick, warm, and entirely suffocating. I kept glancing back at the heavy wooden doors at the rear of the room. The hallway outside was empty. There was still no sign of William Sterling. The side door opened and the judge entered the room. He was a stern, serious-looking man with silver hair and reading glasses perched precariously on the edge of his nose. The bailiff instructed everyone to rise. When the judge took his seat, the proceedings began with terrifying speed. My father's lead attorney stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and approached the wooden podium in the center of the room. He was an absolute master of courtroom performance. He spoke in a low, deeply respectful tone, perfectly modulating his voice to project profound sorrow and heavy burden. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, his voice echoing clearly. "We are here today to officially enter the last will and testament of Thomas Myers into probate. My client, Robert Myers, is the sole surviving son and the exclusively designated executor of this estate." The lawyer handed a pristine blue legal folder to the bailiff, who carried it up to the judge's bench. The document submitted is fully notarized, witnessed, and dated 2015. The lawyer continued smoothly. It clearly and undeniably outlines the deceased's final wishes regarding his assets. Furthermore, Your Honor, my client brings an incredibly heavy heart to this court today. Robert has spent the last few agonizing days mourning the tragic loss of his father while simultaneously dealing with an incredibly hostile and difficult family situation. My father bowed his head at exactly the right moment. He reached up and pinched the bridge of his nose, closing his eyes tightly. It was the absolute perfect picture of a grieving, exhausted son who was simply trying to do the right thing under terrible circumstances. It made me physically sick to watch him act. This was the same man who had refused to leave a country club dinner while his father was actively dying. The lawyer pressed forward, his voice hardening, just slightly shifting from sorrow to stern authority. "It brings us absolutely no pleasure to request this specific motion, Your Honor. However, the deceased's granddaughter, Chloe Myers, has been illegally occupying the primary estate property since the passing. She has become hostile, erratic, and deeply uncooperative. She has explicitly refused to vacate the premises despite being given formal legal notice. We are formally requesting an emergency court order of eviction to be executed by law enforcement by 5 o'clock this evening. The estate holds highly valuable assets, antiques, and financial documents. My client needs to secure the property immediately to prevent any potential damage, vandalism, or theft by a disgruntled and unstable family member. I stared at the lawyer in absolute paralyzing shock. Disgruntled family member, vandalism, theft. They were openly accusing me of being a criminal threat to the very house I had sacrificed my youth to clean, maintain, and protect. They were painting me as an unhinged squatter trying to steal from them. I turned my head slightly to look at the gallery. My mother sat there with her face arranged in an expression of tragic maternal concern. She shook her head slowly, playing the role of a mother completely heartbroken by her daughter's terrible erratic behavior. Brandon was openly typing on his phone, completely bored by the legal proceedings, probably looking at expensive tile swatches for the house he was preparing to steal. The sheer audacity of their lies felt like a heavy, suffocating weight pressing directly down on my chest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up, slam my hands on the table, and tell the judge exactly what these monsters had done. I wanted to tell the court about the predatory bridge loans they had taken out. I wanted to tell them about Brandon's $120,000 luxury sports car. I wanted to tell them about the European cruise my mother had booked, using money meant for my grandfather's legacy. I thought about the 6 grueling years I had spent in that house. I thought about the thousands of hours sitting by his bedside, listening to his breathing, holding his hand when the pain was simply too much for him to bear. I thought about the sheer physical toll the caregiving had taken on my body, the exhaustion that had seeped deep into my very bones. And now the people who had abandoned him completely were sitting 20 feet away, using the legal system to erase my sacrifice and steal his legacy. They were going to take the money and burn it on luxury cars, vacations, and status symbols, leaving me completely destitute on the street. The injustice of it was so massive, so entirely overwhelming, that it felt like it had its own gravitational pull. But I forced my jaw shut. I forced my hands to stay flat on the table. I focused on the polished grain of the mahogany wood. I regulated my breathing, counting silently in my head, remembering Sterling's explicit instructions. We need them to feel invincible. Let them hang themselves. The judge spent a long, agonizing moment reviewing the 2015 will. The silence in the courtroom stretched out heavy and absolute. The only sound in the massive room was the slow, steady ticking of the wall clock and the crisp rustle of legal paper turning. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every second that passed felt like an entire hour. Finally, the judge looked up from the documents. He took off his reading glasses and directed his gaze toward my table. He looked at me sitting there, entirely alone, wearing a plain sweater without a single piece of paper or a lawyer beside me. His eyes held a mixture of professional detachment and genuine, heavy pity. "Miss Myers," the judge said. His voice was deep and commanding. "The petitioner has submitted a valid notarized legal document naming him as the sole beneficiary and the legal executor of this estate. They have also requested an emergency order to have you removed from the property by the end of the business day. This is a very serious motion. Do you have legal representation present with you today to formally contest this document or to respond to this emergency eviction request?" I swallowed hard. My throat was completely dry, feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. I looked up at the clock on the wall. It was exactly 9:35 in the morning. I slowly turned my head and looked back at the heavy wooden doors at the rear of the courtroom. They remained firmly closed. The hallway window was empty. There was absolutely no sign of William Sterling. The crushing, terrifying reality of the moment began to settle over my shoulders. If I spoke up right now without a lawyer, without the proper legal foundation to submit the secret, Will, my father's corporate attorneys, would object to every single word I said. They would bury me in complex procedural rules. They would claim I was lying. I would lose everything right here, sitting alone at this empty table. The judge leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the high bench. "Miss Myers," he repeated, his tone slightly more urgent, but still gentle. "I need a verbal answer for the court record. Are you represented by legal counsel today? If you are not, and if you have no formal evidence to present, I am legally inclined to grant the petitioner's motion in its entirety, based on the documented evidence they have provided." I turned my head and looked across the wide aisle. My father was watching me with cold, triumphant, merciless eyes. He had won. He knew he had won. He was watching me break. Behind him in the gallery, my mother leaned forward over the wooden railing. She caught my eye and offered a slow, venomous smirk that chilled me to the bone. She mouthed two words at me with absolute undeniable clarity. "It is over." I gripped the edge of the plaintiff table, closing my eyes, waiting for the final blow. The judge sighed heavily, a sound of resigned finality. He reached for his heavy wooden gavel. He lifted it high into the air, preparing to strike the sounding block and legally strip me of my home, my inheritance, and my grandfather's entire legacy. "Very well," the judge announced to the quiet room. "Seeing no formal objection and noting the absence of opposing counsel, I am prepared to grant the petitioner's motion for emergency." He never finished the sentence. The heavy oak doors at the very back of the courtroom swung open with a massive echoing crash that startled absolutely everyone in the room. The bailiff jumped back from his station. My father whipped his head around so fast his neck cracked. The judge froze entirely, his wooden gavel suspended high in midair. Walking down the center aisle with slow, deliberate, and incredibly powerful strides was William Sterling. He was not the tired, dusty, defeated man I had met in the suburban strip mall 4 days ago. He was impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored midnight blue suit that made my father's expensive clothes look like cheap imitations. His posture was perfectly straight. His silver hair was neatly combed. His expression was absolutely lethal. He carried a single pristine red folder in his left hand. He did not look at my father. He did not spare a single glance for the expensive corporate lawyers who had once conspired to ruin his career. He walked straight past the respondent table, bringing a sudden electric tension into the stifling courtroom. Sterling stopped right beside my empty table. He stood tall, placed his hand reassuringly on the back of my chair, and looked directly up at the judge. He opened the red folder with a sharp, definitive flick of his wrist, revealing the crisp white pages inside. "Objection, Your Honor," Sterling said. His voice was deep, resonant, and completely unapologetic, filling every corner of the vast room with undeniable authority. "The petitioner is presenting a revoked document." The heavy oak door of the courtroom swung shut behind William Sterling with a definitive thud that echoed like a vault locking into place. He did not rush. He walked down the center aisle with the calm and measured stride of a man who held the absolute truth in his hands. He wore a midnight blue suit that seemed to absorb the stale light of the room. He stopped directly beside my small empty table, placed his hand reassuringly on the back of my wooden chair, and looked up at the judge. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice deep, resonant, and completely unapologetic, "the petitioner is presenting a revoked document. I am submitting the true last will and testament of Thomas Myers, executed in 2023. My father, Robert, let out a sharp and dismissive scoff. "Your Honor, this is an outrage. My father was suffering from advanced Parkinson's disease. He was not in any condition to draft a new will. This man is a disgraced attorney trying to exploit my grieving family." Sterling did not even look at my father. He simply opened the pristine red folder he had carried into the room and handed a thick stack of watermarked paper to the bailiff. "I direct the court's attention to the first 3 pages of the document," Sterling said, smoothly addressing the bench. "You will find sworn and notarized affidavits from 3 independent neurological specialists. They conducted comprehensive cognitive evaluations of Thomas Myers 48 hours before this document was signed. All 3 unanimously certified that he possessed absolute mental clarity, full testamentary capacity, and a profound understanding of his financial estate." The bailiff handed the red folder up to the judge. The courtroom fell into a suffocating and terrifying silence. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap while my fingernails dug into my own palms. Across the aisle, the smug confidence had completely melted off my father's face. The high-priced corporate lawyers sitting beside him suddenly sat up very straight with their legal pads forgotten. In the gallery behind them, my mother, Cynthia, lowered her designer sunglasses, her mouth pressing into a thin and nervous line. My brother, Brandon, actually stopped looking at his phone. The judge adjusted his glasses and opened the folder. The only sound in the massive room was the crisp rustle of heavy paper turning. He read the first page, then the second. I watched his expression carefully. He was a man who had seen decades of bitter family disputes, a man who rarely showed emotion on the bench. But as his eyes scanned the middle of the 3rd page, I saw his eyebrows shoot upward. His eyes widened behind his lenses. He looked up from the document, staring directly at my father with a look of profound and unshielded disgust. "Counselor," the judge said, his voice carrying a new and razor-sharp edge as he looked at my father's lead attorney. "The medical affidavits are fully authenticated and stamped by the State Medical Board. This 2023 document is legally binding. It completely supersedes the 2015 will you submitted this morning." The judge took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone on his desk, and looked out over the silent room. Due to the severe nature of the stipulations within this document, he announced, "I am going to read the core testamentary clause aloud for the official court record." My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I closed my eyes and pictured my grandfather sitting in his leather armchair smiling at me. "I, Thomas Myers, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous testamentary documents," the judge read, his voice filling the cavernous space. "I explicitly and intentionally disinherit my son Robert, my daughter-in-law Cynthia, and my grandson Brandon." A sharp and collective gasp echoed from the gallery. "I make this decision with full knowledge of their actions." The judge continued reading my grandfather's final and undeniable truth. "For 6 years, they abandoned me to my illness. They provided no care, no comfort, and no love. They viewed my life as a burden and my death as a financial opportunity. Their neglect was absolute, and their greed is unforgivable. I will not allow my legacy to fund their selfishness." I opened my eyes. My mother was gripping the wooden railing of the gallery so tightly, her knuckles were completely white. My father looked as though all the air had been violently punched out of his lungs. Therefore, the judge read his voice, ringing with absolute finality. "I bequeath 100% of my estate, including the primary residence in Lake Forest, the entire liquid asset portfolio, the vintage automobile collection, and the proceeds of my industrial patents totaling approximately $13 million solely and exclusively to my granddaughter Chloe Myers. She is the only member of this family who understands the true meaning of sacrifice." For one long and suspended second, the courtroom was absolutely silent. The reality of the words hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. I was not going to be evicted. I was not penniless. The man who had raised me had reached beyond the grave to wrap his arms around me one last time, shielding me from the monsters who shared my blood. Then the courtroom completely erupted. It was a tidal wave of noise and chaos. My mother lost her mind. She shot to her feet in the gallery, her face flushing a dark and ugly red, her designer handbag crashing to the floor. "That is a lie," my mother screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical, completely abandoning her wealthy suburban facade. "She manipulated him. She kept us away from him. She brainwashed a dying man to steal our money. That 13 million belongs to us." "Order in this court," the judge bellowed, slamming his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block. My father's lead attorney jumped up from his chair, his face slick with sudden sweat. "Your Honor, we claim immediate fraud. This is elder abuse. We demand an emergency injunction. We demand a full psychiatric review of the deceased's medical history. I motion for an immediate and total freeze on all estate assets until a formal investigation can be launched. They cannot take this money." The room was spinning with screaming voices, slamming gavels, and the frantic shuffling of legal teams trying to stop a runaway train. My father was gripping the edge of his table, his chest heaving, staring at me with a hatred so pure it burned. They thought they could still fight. They thought their lawyers could tie this up in court for years, draining the estate until I surrendered. But William Sterling was not finished. He did not raise his voice to compete with the screaming. He simply waited for the judge to strike the gavel one more time, forcing a tense and breathless quiet over the room. Sterling buttoned his suit jacket, stepped out from behind my table, and offered my father a smile that was absolutely terrifying in its predatory calm. "Your Honor," Sterling said smoothly, his voice slicing through the remaining tension like a scalpel. "The petitioner can certainly attempt to contest this valid will, though they will fail. However, before they make any decisions regarding their legal future, I strongly direct the court's attention to Section 4 of the document you are holding, the clawback clause." "Your Honor," Sterling said smoothly, stepping away from the plaintiff table and directing his steady gaze up at the bench. "The petitioner can attempt to contest this valid will, though they will fail." However, before they make decisions regarding their legal future, I strongly direct the court's attention to Section 4 of the document you are holding. The clawback clause. My father, Robert, tightened his grip on his chair. His expensive corporate lawyer stood frozen, unsure of how to navigate a trap they never saw coming. Sterling did not wait for their permission. He connected the black flash drive to the courtroom display system and pressed play. The large monitors mounted on the walls flickered to life. My grandfather appeared on the screen, sitting in his favorite leather armchair, looking healthier and sharper than he had in years. The courtroom fell utterly silent as his resonant voice echoed through the high ceilings. I know exactly what my son Robert is capable of, my grandfather said from the screen, staring directly into the camera lens with absolute authority. And I know exactly what he did in 2018. My father went completely rigid. All the artificial grief vanished from his face, replaced by sudden sheer terror. For years, my grandfather continued, his voice echoing with righteous anger. Robert thought I was a naive old man. He thought I did not review my own financial statements. He secretly forged my signature and systematically embezzled $800,000 from my private retirement accounts. He funneled every single penny of my stolen money into his golden child Brandon and his endless string of failed tech startups. They bled me dry to fund their vanity projects. In the gallery, my brother Brandon dropped his expensive smartphone. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. My mother Cynthia covered her mouth with trembling hands. I did not press criminal charges at the time because I wanted to spare the family name from public humiliation, my grandfather stated clearly on the screen. But I documented every fraudulent transfer, every fake signature, and every stolen dollar. A certified forensic financial audit is attached to this will. The video faded to black. Sterling stepped right into the center of the courtroom. He looked at my father with the predatory smile of a man who had waited years for this exact moment. Your Honor, Sterling announced, his voice ringing with triumph. Section 4 of the 2023 will contains a strict, legally binding clawback clause. Before this probate process can be officially settled, before a single asset can be processed, Robert Myers is legally mandated to repay the stolen $800,000 directly back to the estate. And since my client Chloe Myers is now the sole beneficiary of that entire estate, Robert owes that money directly to his daughter, complete with 6 years of compounding interest. The devastating reality crashed down on my family. They had walked into this courtroom convinced they were multi-millionaires. Because of blinding greed, my father had leveraged the presumed $13 million estate to take out massive bridge loans from predatory lenders. They spent money they did not have. And now, not only were they getting absolutely nothing from the estate, they were instantly and catastrophically bankrupt. They owed those ruthless private lenders hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they owed me nearly $1 million on top of that. My father collapsed heavily into his wooden chair. Thick beads of sweat rolled down his forehead. He gripped his chest, gasping for air, as his corporate empire crumbled into dust. His lawyers were already packing their briefcases, realizing their wealthy client was suddenly a broke fraud who could not afford their legal fees and would likely face criminal charges soon. Behind him, the golden child fell apart. Brandon grabbed his hair in wild panic. He had just financed a $120,000 Porsche using the bridge loan. He realized the bank would repossess it by Friday. His wife Jessica burst into loud, ugly tears, looking at Brandon with pure disgust, finally understanding she was married to a penniless failure who dragged her into financial ruin. My mother sat paralyzed, realizing her European cruise and country club lifestyle were gone forever. The judge looked down at my father with absolute contempt. He gathered his papers, straightened his black robe, and picked up his heavy wooden gavel. The medical affidavits are verified and the financial audit is clear, the judge declared, his voice echoing with final authority. I hereby certify the 2023 will as valid. The estate is awarded entirely to Chloe Myers and the clawback clause is fully activated. This court is adjourned. He slammed the gavel down hard against the sounding block. The sharp cracking noise was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the sweet, undeniable sound of absolute permanent freedom. If you have ever been the one who always sacrifices, the one who does grueling work while everyone else takes credit, please listen right now. Love is never supposed to be a transaction. You do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. You deserve respect, and sometimes the only way to get it is to walk away and let them face their consequences. If you have ever been treated like the hired help by your own blood relatives, type the words "enough is enough" in the comments below to let me know I am not fighting this battle alone. And if seeing justice served today brought a genuine smile to your face, please hit that like button. Now subscribe to the channel today and tell me exactly where you are watching from and what time it is there. Your kind support truly means everything to me. Until next time, my friends, please always remember that your personal boundaries are your absolute best, most impenetrable armor. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of the Cook County Probate Court swung shut on my former life. It is a crisp Tuesday morning in late October. I am sitting on the wide wrap-around wooden porch of my grandfather's house. The vintage rocking chair creaks softly underneath me in a rhythmic and comforting sway. I am holding a warm ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The sprawling suburban estate is entirely quiet today, but it is no longer the terrifying and suffocating silence of an impending eviction or a medical emergency. It is the deep settling and profound peace of absolute ownership. The complicated legal probate process officially cleared 3 weeks ago without a single complication. The massive stock portfolios, the liquid bank accounts, the vintage car collection resting safely in the carriage house, and the permanent deed to this beautiful historic property have all been legally transferred directly into my name. I am 31 years old, and I am completely financially free. I did not immediately buy designer clothes or book luxury European cruises the way my mother had attempted to do. Instead, I used a small fraction of my new capital to officially launch my own independent supply chain consulting firm. I transformed my grandfather's old mahogany-lined study into my executive home office. My mother had once mocked my entire career, calling me a glorified maid who simply moved cardboard boxes on a spreadsheet. Yesterday afternoon, I signed a massive multi-year logistics contract with one of the largest shipping distributors in the Midwest. I am now the chief executive officer of my own life. The autumn air smells like fallen leaves and fresh rain. I take a long sip of my hot coffee and let the bright morning sun warm my tired face. I do not have to wash harsh hospital bedsheets today. I do not have to puree meals or administer heavy pain medications. I do not have to cook massive holiday dinners for ungrateful people who refuse to look me in the eye. I just get to exist in my own space. The profound peace I feel this morning stands in absolute staggering contrast to the total devastation currently consuming my parents and my brother. When attorney William Sterling activated the secret clawback clause in that courtroom, he did not just win my inheritance for me. He pulled the single thread that rapidly unraveled my family's entire fraudulent financial empire. My father, Robert, had always genuinely believed he was the smartest man in any given room. He firmly believed his predatory bridge loans were a calculated corporate risk that would easily pay off. But those private high-interest lenders did not care about his exclusive country club memberships or his expensive tailored suits. When the judge officially ruled that my father owed my newly acquired estate $800,000 plus 6 years of compounding interest, the lenders immediately called in his massive debts. My parents were given exactly 30 days to produce over $1 million in liquid cash to satisfy their multiple creditors. They completely failed. The financial collapse was swift, brutal, and entirely public. To avoid catastrophic bankruptcy and potential criminal charges for the original embezzlement scheme, my parents were legally forced to list their sprawling luxury home for immediate sale. They did not get the luxury of carefully staging the house or waiting for the perfect high-paying buyer. It was a desperate, rushed, and humiliating estate liquidation. I heard through the suburban grapevine that my mother, Cynthia, wept openly and hysterically on her manicured front lawn while estate liquidators carried out her expensive custom furniture and her designer clothing collections. The first-class European cruise she had loudly bragged about to all her wealthy friends was abruptly cancelled, and the massive non-refundable deposit was completely forfeited. My parents lost their exclusive country club memberships because they could no longer afford the exorbitant monthly dues. They were forced to pack their remaining meager belongings and move into a cheap, cramped rental property 2 towns away, far from the wealthy neighbors they had spent their entire lives trying to impress and manipulate. My golden child brother Brandon experienced an even faster and far more humiliating downfall. He had confidently financed a $120,000 luxury Porsche using his anticipated imaginary inheritance and as direct collateral. Less than 48 hours after the disastrous probate hearing concluded, a heavy flatbed tow truck arrived at his house in the middle of the dark night. The bank repossessed the luxury sports car right out of his driveway. Brandon reportedly tried to run outside in his pajamas and argue aggressively with the tow truck driver, but the legal paperwork was undeniable and absolute. The loss of that expensive status symbol was the final fatal blow to his superficial marriage. Jessica had married a man she believed was a brilliant tech entrepreneur backed by unlimited generational family wealth. When she finally realized Brandon was actually deeply in debt, legally disinherited, and utterly incapable of holding a real job, the grand illusion completely shattered. Jessica filed for divorce exactly 3 weeks after the sports car was towed away. She packed her expensive designer clothes, hired moving men, and moved back into her parents' house, leaving Brandon completely alone in an empty living room. My brother was immediately forced to abandon his ridiculous tech startup dreams. He currently lives in a tiny, depressing one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. He took a humiliating entry-level job selling televisions at a big box retail store just to make his minimum credit card payments. The golden child finally had to face the harsh real world my father had maliciously threatened me with. They actually tried to reach out and contact me, of course. Desperation makes toxic people completely forget their own cruelty. 2 months ago, my cell phone rang on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I looked at the bright digital screen and saw my father's name flashing. I answered it slowly, mostly out of a morbid, detached curiosity. His voice sounded completely different. The arrogant, commanding corporate tone was entirely gone, replaced by a thin, nervous, and trembling rasp. He asked me how I was doing. He asked about my new consulting business. Then he cleared his throat loudly and asked if we could potentially discuss a temporary family loan. He said my mother was struggling severely with the lifestyle adjustment and Brandon needed just a little bit of seed capital to get back on his feet. He actually dared to use the word family. He told me that blood was thicker than water and that we needed to stick together during hard economic times. I could hear my mother crying softly in the background, a pathetic and calculated performance designed to pull at my heartstrings. I listened to him speak for 3 full minutes. I did not interrupt his pathetic speech. I simply thought about the dark night he coldly handed me a 30-day eviction notice while my grandfather's body was still warm in the next room. I thought about him sitting smugly at the formal dining table, offering me a miserable $5,000 severance package to sign away my legal rights and disappear into poverty. I told my father very calmly that I was not a bank and that he was no longer my family. I reminded him that he had forcefully fired the hired help and the help was permanently unavailable to assist him. I hung up the phone before he could formulate a response. I opened my contact settings and I permanently blocked his phone number. Then I blocked my mother. Then I blocked Brandon and Jessica. I did not feel a single ounce of lingering guilt. I did not feel angry or bitter. I just felt incredibly clean. They were finally and permanently erased from my world, locked outside the fortress I had built. I finished the last sip of my coffee on the porch, set the empty ceramic mug on the painted wooden railing, and grabbed my car keys from my pocket. I drive my dependable sedan through the quiet tree-lined streets of the wealthy suburb toward the local historical cemetery. The autumn leaves are brilliant, fiery shades of gold, orange, and crimson falling gently across the manicured green lawns of the neighborhood. I pull through the tall wrought iron gates and park near the rolling green hill where Grandpa Thomas is buried. I walk slowly across the damp morning grass, carrying a large, beautiful bouquet of fresh yellow roses. They were always his absolute favorite flower, the ones he used to grow in the backyard garden before his hands began to shake from the illness. I kneel down gently beside his polished gray granite headstone. The air is cool, crisp, and wonderfully peaceful. I carefully arrange the vibrant yellow roses against the cold stone, taking a long silent moment to trace the deeply engraved letters of his name with my fingertips. I tell him quietly into the morning air that I finally did it. I tell him that the house is completely secure, The new business is thriving, and I am entirely safe from the people who tried to ruin us both. I sit back comfortably on the damp grass and look up at the wide, clear blue sky spanning above the cemetery trees. For so many years of my life, I truly believed that my worth was defined entirely by how much pain I could quietly endure for the sake of other people. I honestly thought that if I sacrificed my professional career, my youth, my financial independence, and my own personal happiness, my family would eventually recognize my immense value. I thought love was a simple transaction paid in daily blood sweat and endless silence. But sitting here today, breathing in the fresh autumn air, I finally understand the magnificent magnitude of the gift my grandfather truly left me. The $13 million and the massive residential estate were incredible, life-changing financial assets. But the vast amount of money was never the real inheritance he intended to leave me. The real inheritance was the absolute undeniable truth. My grandfather loved me deeply enough to see the harsh reality of my daily situation. He saw my total physical exhaustion. He saw my quiet, desperate, and unwavering loyalty. And he saw the calculated, predatory, and greedy nature of the people who shared our last name. He used his final, painful years on Earth to meticulously build an impenetrable legal fortress around me. He deliberately handed me the powerful legal tools, the overwhelming financial resources, and the absolute moral permission to finally stop being a silent victim. He gave me the ultimate power to fight back and reclaim my stolen life. I did not just win a highly contentious probate battle in a cold, echoing courtroom. I won my absolute and permanent freedom. I honored the only man who ever truly saw my worth by bravely refusing to let his hard-earned legacy fund the terrible people who had completely abandoned him in his time of greatest need. I stand up slowly from the grass and brush off the knees of my dark jeans. I take one last lingering look at the beautiful granite headstone, feeling a profound, unbreakable, and eternal connection to the great man resting peacefully beneath it. I walk back toward my parked car, with my head held high, my shoulders completely relaxed, and my heart entirely full of bright hope. My painful past is buried deeply in the ground behind me, but my future is wide open, entirely mine to control, and patiently waiting for me to step forward and live it. If you are listening to this right now, and you recognize your own reflection in my story, I want you to pay very close attention to what I am about to say. If you are the one in your family who always gives, the one who always sacrifices your own happiness, the one who stepped up to do the grueling, backbreaking work when everyone else conveniently walked away, you know exactly how heavy that invisible burden feels. You are probably the person who is constantly told to just be the bigger person. You are the one expected to swallow your valid anger, to silence your own basic needs, and to keep the peace at all costs. They will look you right in the eye and tell you that family is absolutely everything, implying that sharing DNA demands your unconditional loyalty. But I learned the absolute hardest way possible that true love is never a cold transaction. You absolutely do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. For 6 long years, I honestly believed that if I just gave enough of my time, my savings, and my youth, my parents would eventually recognize my worth. I thought my quiet devotion would finally earn me a respected place at their table. I was completely wrong. Selfish people do not suddenly develop a conscience just because they watch you suffering. They simply learn that your boundaries are weak, and they will continue to take from you until you have absolutely nothing left to give. My parents and my golden child brother looked at my sacrifice and saw only an opportunity for their own limitless greed. They saw me as the invisible hired help, but the exact moment I stopped waiting for their validation and started fighting fiercely for my own survival, the entire dynamic shifted permanently. The suffocating power they held over me was nothing but a fragile illusion built entirely on my obedient silence. You do not need a secret inheritance or a brilliant courtroom lawyer to reclaim your life. You simply need the profound courage to stop accepting less than you deserve. Sometimes the ultimate form of justice is simply walking away and letting manipulative people drown in the natural consequences of their own terrible actions. It took me hitting absolute rock bottom to finally understand that my blind loyalty was being actively weaponized against me. If you have ever been treated like a burden or they hired help by your own blood, please type the word enough in the comments below. Let me know I am not alone in this. And if seeing my family face ruin brought you genuine satisfaction today, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss out. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Your support means everything to me. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, please remember that your boundaries are your armor.